All right, welcome in everybody. Good evening. It is Sunday night. We are here for our Come Follow Me, and we are in the book of Esther tonight. So, welcome in everybody. Make sure that you are going ahead and subscribing. I am Timothy Berman, Faith and Reason, LDS Covenantal Apologetics, and I have with me Jessica of Christ Pearls. And we are going to have a couple other people maybe joining in. One for sure. We may have another one coming in, and we are going to be talking about the book of Esther. So, welcome in everybody. Hit that like, get the shares out, drop your thoughts in the live chat, and let's have a good discussion tonight. And if you have any questions, we might have time for answering your questions. And so,
Yeah, and I've got a
let's
couple of discussion question prompts that we could put in the comments if you want, if people
all
want to
right.
comment on them. So, okay, well, what do we want to start with? Do you want to give the acrostic really quick and just show it, or do we want to do it at the end?
We can do it towards the end, I guess.
Okay, so, and what was our acrostic word? It's Esther, right?
It is Esther, yes. So we're
Okay.
studying the book of Esther. The acrostic is Esther, which actually is really good because I like doing these acrostics.
Mhm.
They help us understand.
Do you wanna give us the words for each letter, and then maybe what we'll do is, like, we'll weave it into our discussion as we go chapter by chapter, and then at the end, you
Yeah.
could give, like, an overview?
Yeah, we could do that. Yeah.
Okay.
So the acrostic for this study for the book of Esther is E, where we embrace your divine placement. S is to seek the Lord through fasting. And then T is to take courageous action. And then H is to humble the heart before pride destroys it. And then E is exercise wisdom in timing and speech. And then R is remember the Lord's reversal and rejoice in deliverance. So we have some good stuff for you. And I'm going to kind of sit back and let the ladies have the discussion tonight.
So tonight, my friend Rachel's gonna join us. We've had her on before, and she put together some really beautiful symbolism ideas. So what the plan is for tonight, everyone who's just joining us right now, is we're going to basically look at the literary structure of Esther, and I'm going to go through a couple of different chiasmuses I've used for this, and we're going to go through kind of like a variation of one of the main scholarly chiasmus. Um, I know renditions that I found that I think works really well. And so let me just pull up our first slide for the evening so that we can kind of look at that. I put a little overview together. So, kind of like a high level, I guess you could say bullet point chiasmus. Let me see. Does that fit? Let's see if we can make that a little bigger. Does that work? Is that looking good?
Yes.
I feel like we want less black on the sides there. Okay,
There we
that
go.
looks better, right? Okay, there. Got to have it formatted for that screen, right? Whoops, it's messing up again. There we go. Okay, so here, let me go back. We'll do, so do you see here on the right, I have this little, it's kind of like the high level bullet point of the chiasmus structure. So we're going to actually look at a more detailed one. And what we're going to be drawing on, let me just show you really quick. Here, let me change. Let's see. I need to get another. Hold on, I'm going to stop sharing that one really quick. And I want to share my screen so I can pull up a couple of. Here, let me share a window here of probably this one. And yeah, this one. Okay, so I found these really great, um, just different versions of Esther, the chiastic structure. This one is one that someone made where they color coded it. It's a little different than the main scholarly one. And notice here how you can see chapters 1 parallels chapter 10 and part of one is paralleling 9, and they're going off of the themes to create this parallel structure. Do you see that? And then at the center of the structure is what you have as this great reversal of circumstances. And in this one, they're emphasizing the climax as Haman's, I guess, pride. It's like the height of his pride right before the fall. And this other one is the one that I'm actually going to be working off of the most. Let's see. Can you see that? Does that look okay? And this one is one that is an adaptation from this scholar, David A. Dorsey, from his book, The Literary Structure of the Old Testament, a commentary on Genesis to Malachi. And he's like an evangelical who basically wrote a whole book about just all these different structures in the Bible. And this is pretty much how he has the Esther one. This is one that someone just slightly altered. And the way that they altered it, you'll kind of see down here, they kind of put this more in a chronological order. So like chapter 10, where Mordecai gets promoted, it kind of comes like technically right before those letters go out. But it's just a slight more detailed variation of the one that was in the book. And so we're going to be using this as our literary structure guide. And the turning point here, we are going to make a note. It's in chapter 6. It's technically 1 through like 14 that most people put as the turning point. But the way that this one breaks it down in more detail, it's kind of pinpointing this middle verse, chapter 6, verse 10. So we're going to be looking at that. And hopefully that'll be a fun way to approach Esther. And let me pull up my slides again. Okay, so as we go through this, we're going to kind of go chapter by chapter. So for you guys who are at home and you're in the comments, if you want to open up Esther, just go to chapter 1 and you'll be able to follow along with what we'll be talking about tonight and hopefully be able to see the literary structure that exists here, which is one of my favorite features of this whole study, because I feel like whenever you notice these literary structures, it helps you come up with an interpretation. So do you see here how we have feast parallels Purim at the end? And there is a feast associated with that too. You've got Esther being crowned, Esther's request. You've got Mordecai saves the king. The Jews are saved. Haman's plot with the counter decree. You have Esther responds, Esther is given. You have the first banquet, the second banquet. Those are both banquets that she calls. You have like the question of honor, and then where Mordecai's honored. You have this robe and horse where Haman thinks it's for him, and then it's for Mordecai. And then you have that turning point in chapter 6, verse 10, which we'll talk about. And the reason I wanted to talk about this structure is because as we move through these next few Old Testament chapters, when we get to Isaiah, there's also a structure there. And I have coming up later, after we've moved through these chapters, I want to do a parallel where you can see Isaiah's structure compared to Esther's and see if you can recognize the similarities and what that pattern may imply. So hopefully this will be fun tonight. Okay, so our context for Esther. And by the way, let me see. I had a few notes in here too. I might have already kind of talked about this. Yeah, so I mentioned Dorsey. He's an evangelical scholar. He died in 2014 and he had done that book. And in his original structure, it was Esther 6, 1 through 10 that he had as the center point, with 10 being kind of the height of that. And yeah, so basically a chiasmus, for those of you who don't know, it's just an ancient Hebrew way of writing where authors would organize narratives so that they're not just chronological, but they're symmetrical with corresponding scenes that lead to like a central climax that you'll find at the middle of the structure. And so that's how Esther is structured. All right, so enough about that. Now, the world in exile is really interesting. There's a lot going on here that's going to overlap with what we talked about last week with Nehemiah and Ezra. And hopefully this timeline will kind of help you place Esther. So you have this captivity, which is actually the book of Daniel. And so it's going to be weird because we're reading about Esther right now. We were reading about Ezekiel before, and all of this comes actually after Daniel. And then we're going to jump back to Daniel later. So just try to keep the timeline straight in your mind. And I'll try to do this again when we get to Daniel, just because, I don't know, when you're reading the Old Testament just in order, the way that we're doing it for the Come Follow Me, it is confusing because you're jumping around so much in the timeline. And so you'll see here's kind of Ezekiel, that second part, 597. You've got the temple destroyed. We haven't even read Daniel or Ezekiel yet, so we're going to be jumping backwards in time when we get to those. What we did read about was Babylon falling to Cyrus, which is what was happening in Ezra and Nehemiah. And we talked about Zerubbabel, remember the governor there, who's kind of governing this return for the Jews to go back and build their second temple. We talked all about the building of that temple, some of the trials that they faced. We talked about Haggai and Zechariah. And Esther kind of fits in this period, 483 to 473 BC. So just think like circa 480 BC is the time. And this is where many of the Jews have gone back to Jerusalem, and they're in the process of trying to get this temple. They have been for a couple decades, and now they're kind of getting towards the end of that, and more have moved in since the time that we discussed last week, but there's still many tens of thousands of people kind of scattered throughout the old Babylonian Empire and this Persian Empire. And Esther takes place during the time of the Medes and the Persians. So for those of you who are familiar with Daniel, remember when Nebuchadnezzar, who's the king of Babylon, back in the time when Jerusalem gets destroyed, it's like the third time, and people get carried away captive into Babylon, including Daniel. He has that vision of the tower, or not the tower, but the statue, and it's like Babylon and all the great kingdoms. Well, they're in the time of the Medes and the Persians during Esther's time. And the reason why it's like Medes and Persians, you'll notice in the book of Esther, it'll sometimes be talking about the Medes or the Persians. It's because there's some overlap between these kingdoms. And this king that we're talking about, he's kind of like over all these provinces. It lists out the provinces that he's over. So before we begin the story of Esther, I think it's just helpful to place her in her historical setting, because the time that it's taking place, I mean, this is nearly a century after Jerusalem had fallen to Babylon back in 586, and after Lehi had left Jerusalem with his family. And so Israel's exile, it kind of unfolds in stages. Like Daniel's taken captive in that first deportation in 605 BC. Then you had Ezekiel in the second, which was 597 BC. And finally, Jerusalem and Solomon's temple were destroyed in 586. So there were like 3 attacks on Jerusalem that resulted in this scattering. And each time, like, people are getting sent to different locations. Some are staying, many are not. They're in exile. So the exile doesn't last forever, though. In 539 BC, we have Cyrus. That's what we discussed last week with him ordering the Jews, or allowing them to be able to come back. And so that kind of starts moving people around again. And at this point, anyone who's called a Jew would have been anybody who was living in the kingdom of Judah at the time of these 3 attacks from Babylon. And so some families returned with Zerubbabel, and later with Ezra, and then still again with Nehemiah. So they're kind of returning in stages. And the second temple was completed in 516 BC. But many Jews actually chose, or might not have been able to return, and so they had remained kind of scattered throughout this very vast Persian Empire, which you can kind of see here. I've kind of marked like the territory it's covering. It's a very large area. The empire stretched from India to Ethiopia, encompassing 127 provinces, making it the largest empire God's covenant people had ever lived under. Esther and Mordecai lived in Susa, which you can see right there on the map. And it was one of the royal, like, capital cities of Persia, and it was hundreds of miles away from Jerusalem. That setting creates this central tension of the whole story. These are covenant people living in exile, far from their promised land, far from the temple, and under the authority of a foreign king. And so we're going to be asking a question as we're studying tonight. Can God's covenant people remain faithful while living in a world that doesn't share their covenant? Well, we're going to learn about that in Esther. So Esther kind of answers this question, and I would say it's a resounding yes is the answer. And we're going to study how God does that And I think something that's really interesting in Esther is that it's kind of through like a quiet faithfulness and I would say hidden providence that all of these events come about. So there's no parting of the Red Sea, there's no even mention of the name of God, but it is clearly God's hand involved in these people's lives. And so we'll talk about God being in the details of our lives. And another interesting historical detail is that the book of Esther, it's only um, a biblical book. So it's actually not in the Dead Sea Scrolls. It wasn't discovered in the Qumran caves. And it's not in the Islamic record either. They don't have this story either. Every other book of the Hebrew Bible is represented by at least fragments, but Esther isn't. Scholars have proposed several explanations for this. Some suggest that the Qumran community may have been uncomfortable with Esther because God's name never appears in the book and its setting takes place outside of the land of Israel. Other points to the community's different calendar, which may have affected their observance of Purim, so they don't recognize Purim. They're more orthodox, this community, and I actually found a little article on this. Maybe I can link it in the comments. It's really short. It's just like a little quick blurb that talks about why Esther isn't in the Dead Sea Scrolls or in any of the other of these sources. And ultimately, we don't really know why it's missing, but the Christians and in the time of the New Testament, they really liked the story of Esther. And they viewed her as kind of like a bride archetype. So we're going to talk a little bit about that later coming up too. So think about bride symbolism as we're going through the literary structure tonight. Ironically, the absence of Esther among the Dead Sea Scrolls, I think actually mirrors one of the book's central themes. So God's name is hidden from this whole narrative, and the book itself is kind of hidden in its own way in all of the archaeological collections that we have, but neither the absence of God or the absence of Esther in these other books diminishes what I think is a very powerful message about deliverance. And we'll see that theme as the central point in the chiasmus. And so we'll talk a little bit about that too. And then one final observation just before we begin is that the book of Esther, I think it has, I would say, providence woven in the details of every chapter. So even though God's name isn't mentioned, what I'm hoping is that as we're going through the story, you'll try to find where God's hand is intervening or where he might be using someone to help fulfill his purposes, whether they realize it or not. So maybe just a little food for thought. Okay, so here's how we're going to read Esther tonight. I want to kind of use it the way that I think the literary structure intends. So it's not just arranged chronologically, it's arranged literarily. And the author, whoever the author is of Esther, we're not sure, but they intentionally constructed the book as a large chiasmus, which is a literary pattern where the first half mirrors the second half, guiding the reader toward a central theme or a turning point, which usually happens in the middle of the story. And it's like a reversal of circumstances. This outline that we're going to be looking at is the one from Dorsey, mostly with a couple of variations. And as I studied Esther, I found another chiastic analysis, which I showed you. It's the color-coded one, that it kind of tweaks it just slightly. And so the details varied just ever so slightly. And we're going to talk a little bit about both because I think both of them emphasize an interesting point. Like the color-coded one, it emphasizes Haman's pride, and the main one emphasizes like the actual turn. So basically you have kind of like the climax where it's like right before the reversal, and that's what one highlights. And then you have right after the reversal when things start turning around is usually the midpoint. And what I think is interesting about that is there's another scholar who I took a class from, and he's a linguistic scholar, and he wrote this paper called The Epiphanic Arc. His name is Jared Lambert. And I feel like the way that this other color-coded one, where it's kind of getting to that high point of Haman's pride, it sort of is following that model of pinpointing the climax in a story. And it kind of fits more with the way that American television movies kind of do their story arc. It's like you get to this climax and it's like something so terrible is going to happen if somebody doesn't come and save someone. And that's kind of the way that the color coded one does. But typically in a chiastic structure, it's actually just past that point where you get kind of like the conclusion right before you see the outcome, and you get a hint at the conclusion. And that's usually how you identify it. And so I don't know if that makes any sense to anyone, but if you look at a lot of these kinds of structures, you'll start to see what I mean. They all kind of follow a very basic framework. And that was just some differences that I noticed in the way that people had approached this. So anyway, I had chosen Dorsey's just because it's more scholarly. He backs it up with a lot of research, and I think it fits more of that kind of technical chiasmus structure from everything that I've read. And I'm not an expert, but I've read quite a few, and I kind of could gather that his was following your typical model and structure. And so I want you to notice how the story narrows in successive layers. So I've got all the layers listed on this slide here. You can kind of see it going into the climax, and then you've got Esther 6:10 at that turning point, and then it goes out. And basically you've got it beginning with royal feasts and decrees by the king. Esther's going to receive a crown. Mordecai is going to save the king. And you'll have Haman's plot developing during this. And then you've got Esther responding. She calls 2 banquets. And the story kind of pushes towards this climax where the question becomes, like, who truly deserves the honor? Is it Haman? Is it Mordecai? Like, what really needs to happen here? And so everything kind of converges at Esther chapter 6, verse 10. And that says, then the king said to Haman, make haste and take the apparel and the horse as thou hast said, and do even so to Mordecai the Jew. And it's just like, whoa, like he thought he was going to get this reward. And then he's being asked to do this for who he perceives as a dissident, an enemy, someone that he hates, which is just a very interesting hinge point in the entire story. And so everything before that moment kind of moves towards death, pride, and destruction for the Jewish people. And then everything after that moment moves towards like new life, humility, deliverance, and like a restoration of the covenant, because people are remembering the Lord their God in the process of all of this. And so as we move through the story today, just notice these small chiastic markers on each slide. I've noted where we're at in the chiasmus on each slide, and they're little signposts just showing you where we're at in the structure. You don't need to memorize it. It's just there to help you see how carefully the author constructed the narrative. And by the end of the lesson, I'm hoping we can come back to the structure and discover that Esther isn't the only biblical book designed this way. Isaiah uses a remarkably similar literary architecture on a much larger scale, like across all 66 chapters. And that comparison, I hope you'll find fascinating. I find it fascinating. So now that we know how this book is built, let's step into the story and start with the royal feast that sets everything in motion. Okay, so a crown removed. This is an interesting way to start a story. And this is a good comment from Thomas. Put that up there. Yeah, it is. A chiasmus is kind of like a divine essay. That's funny. I love that. With the thesis at the center. It's so true. It's like we tend to write, where we give our thesis right at the beginning, and then, we build our essay, like our 5-paragraph essay style. But the way they're doing it is they're putting the thesis at the central point, and they're like mirroring themes. And I love that structure. I think it makes it really easy to start interpreting. One of the things that we can talk about when we get to Isaiah, and a little bit here with Esther, is that when you have a structure and you can see the central theme, then what it does is it helps you to interpret everything in its own context. And the context is the structure and what it's highlighting. And so we'll talk about that when we get to the symbols at the end. We're going to go into the story, then we're going to pull back out of the story, and we'll look at it kind of like high level. So right here, we're in Esther chapter 1. We're in verses like 3 to 22 is kind of where it picks up. And if you look at Esther 1, like 10 through 12, it says on the 7th day when the heart of the king was merry with wine. So I want you to think about the number 7 and what it symbolizes and what wine symbolizes, and think about all of the royal symbols, the royal objects, the biblical numbers. Think about Hebrew textiles. think about colors and all of those things, because as we're moving through the text, I just want you to pull it out. And you guys open up chapter 1 of Esther and kind of go through and highlight as we're talking, because we're not going to have time to read every verse, but I just want to kind of move through the literary structure. And then at the end, when my friend Rachel comes on, she's going to talk a little bit about some of these symbols, and I have some slides where we're going to go over that. So hopefully it'll be fun. But if you look at Esther chapter 1 and kind of go over to verses 10 through 12, where it says the seventh. What just happened? Whoops. Not sure what just happened there. Was that you,
Sorry
Tim?
about that. That was probably me.
Okay. Here, let's see. I'm not sure where Rachel's at, but I want to put us back on here too, because I feel like I'm talking and you guys are staring at slides, but you can't see my face. Okay, there we are. Okay, so here we are. And let's see. Okay, so go to Esther chapter 1 and look at verses 10 through 12. We've got on the seventh day, the heart of the king's merry with wine. He commands the people to bring Vashti. So what's happening here is he's celebrating with his princes who he's over, and he's very happy. He's a little drunk and merry, and he wants to show off his really beautiful queen to his friends. So he commands her to come before him, and it says to bring with the royal crown, or the crown royale, to shew the people and the princes her beauty. But the queen Vashti refused to come at the king's commandment. Now, I want to side note here and say that I did a ton of research on, is there any traditions? Like, I looked at the Tanakh, I looked at the Midrash, I looked at lots of different scholarly commentary of maybe why Vashti refuses to come. In Latter-day Saint interpretation, most of our scholars, they tend to view her as modest, like she's not willing to come before the king. And this is, from what I could tell, it was tied to one of the old like Jewish commentaries, like one of the old rabbi commentaries, where he interpreted where it says bring Vashti the queen before the king with the crown royal. He interpreted it as he wanted her to basically go before everyone naked, just wearing her crown, and she refused to do that. And so she ends up becoming kind of like a symbol of just, I don't know, sticking it to the king. It's like, no, dude, I'm not doing that. And that's how a lot of times we interpret it. But honestly, it doesn't say in the text. We don't know why she refuses to come before the king. Another commentary that I read had a tradition that she actually had started developing some kind of like a skin disease, like leprosy or something, eczema, whatever, and didn't want to come before the king, like didn't want to show skin. Other commentaries that I read viewed her as like an adulteress, and that she was very scandalous. And so for her to come before the king and showing off her body, that shouldn't have been anything that she wouldn't do. But for whatever reason, she doesn't come. Now, the context here is she's also putting on a banquet for all the women while he's putting on a banquet for all the men. So could she be busy? I don't know. I don't know what the answer is for why she doesn't come, and I don't like to read into it too much. All we know is that she refuses to come. And at this time, another little bit of historical context is that right up to this moment, I think you'll notice as you're reading the text that women do get listened to by men in these stories. So for example, like Esther has a dialogue with Mordecai. She also has a dialogue with the king, and he does listen to her. Now, to be fair, he also listens to a lot of other people, which we'll talk about. And then, but if you look at Haman's wife, she has some things to say to him that kind of helps him come to this decision of making this gallows for Mordecai. Her and his friends are his influencers there. And so you can see him kind of listening to his wife. And from everything that I could gather and read, it sounded like at the time of this kind of 5th century BC Persian era in this region, there was more of, I wouldn't say equality, but I would say like there was a respect and an honor for women. But it does seem to turn around, and it actually seems like this action right here with Vashti is the catalyst for that, because what ends up happening, if you look at skip down to Esther chapter 1, verse 19. It says, "Let there go a royal commandment from the king that Vashti come no more before the king Ahasuerus." And I think it's Ahasuerus. I don't know how to say it. It's like Ahasuerus or Ahasuerus. I heard it both ways, and I really honestly don't know how to pronounce it, but I'll say Ahasuerus. And it says, "Let the king give her royal estate unto another that is better than she." So he ends up making this royal decree that's actually one he can't revoke because he uses his ring signet. Now, this ring is a royal object. It represents an authority, and not just any authority, but it actually represents like an irrevocable decree. So it can't be like, even the king cannot undo it, which I think is interesting. And it's a little reckless, if you ask me, because he basically makes quite a few of these, and he seems to be delegating a lot of his authority to other people without even really like analyzing the potential consequences of what he's doing, which I thought was kind of interesting for his character. And we can talk about that as we kind of move through the text. So the story opens not with Esther, but with the wealth and power of this Persian empire. And it's all symbolized here throughout the text. Like, notice how his palace, it has marble and all these royal colors like blue and purple and red and just gold and silver, and it highlights the wealth of this kingdom. So this is a very strong, I don't know, theme in the text, I guess you could say. It's like this kingdom is very wealthy. There's a picture that's being painted here where they have so much abundance that it's almost like he doesn't even the king doesn't even know what to do with all the wealth, and people are enjoying it. They're living large in his empire, and so are all of these princes that he's over. And it says that he's over 170 and 20 provinces, so 127, right in verse 1 of chapter 1. And he makes this big feast. This is for all the Media and Persia princes and nobles. And Vashti has one for the women. And then she gets called. And then out of that comes this decree that basically comes through his advisors. So the royal advisors are like, "Oh no, Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's commandment by his chamberlains. Therefore was the king very wroth, and his anger burned in him," it says in verse 12. So he's feeling like this wrath and this anger, and these guys that he's hanging out with are kind of playing on that. And the king, he asks his wise men, which are like his elders and his advisors, who supposedly know about these things. And it says in the King James, it says, "which knew the times." And if you click on times and you look at the footnote, it'll link you over to Chronicles 12:32 and Matthew 16:3. And this is where it's talking about discerning the signs of the times and kind of understanding the global situation that you're in, the world situation that you're in, and understanding what the potential risks are. And so he asks for these guys to counsel him. It lists several of these guys. And then basically they decide that this deed of the queen should come abroad unto all women, it says in verse 17, so that they shall despise their husbands in their eyes if we don't do something about this. So they feel like they have to issue this command that all the women need to obey their husbands. And so that's what they do, that they should give honor to their husbands and be obedient to them. And so that's how the chapter ends, is with this first decree. And so the narrator, again, he doesn't tell us why she refuses. We just know that she does. The text simply says, "But Queen Vashti refused." And so I think rather than speculate, it's better to focus on what the text itself is emphasizing here. And what is being emphasized in her refusal is the change of the course of the story. So this is a catalyst for change. And the king's advisors, after they panic and the queen refuses and they fear all the women in the empire are going to rise up against their husbands, their solution is this irrevocable Persian decree. Vashti's removed, another queen will take her place. And so at first glance, it just seems like palace politics, but from the perspective of the literary structure and just kind of the whole story, it's actually the first example, I think, of hidden providence. And I think that's what the structure wants us to see. Like that's what the literary structure would try to point us to. Because there's no miracle that occurs, there's no prophet who appears, and God isn't mentioned. We're seeing this, what seems like an ordinary political decision, but it's actually preparing the way for Esther's entrance to be able to save her people. And so this is kind of like our first glimpse at the literary structure and how it's functioning, where we've got this royal feast, the queen losing her crown, and letters are getting sent through the empire. This is important too. So think about those royal symbols, royal messengers sending these decrees. And these later themes are going to reverse as Esther's story reaches its conclusion. And so already the author, I think, is inviting us to look beyond the coincidence and see what appears to be random politics actually becomes the means by which God preserves his covenant people. And so, with the throne unexpectedly vacant, the story is now ready for its unlikely heroine, a young Jewish orphan living quietly in exile whose Hebrew name is Hadassah. Now, I do have a slide at the end where I'll go through and I'll talk about the names of these like four main characters and really five. And I didn't really get into Haman's wife, although you could look at her too. She's interesting. She's kind of like an anti-weaver symbol. We've talked about that before. But I spent more time on Esther, Mordecai, Haman, and the king, and a little bit about Vashti, just because she obviously is a catalyst right at the beginning. So right now we're in chiastic structure B. So this was A, and I hope you see here on the slide where it says we have right here where the crown is removed. See, there's A, and then how it kind of starts to overlap into B. So we're in chapters 1 through the beginning of chapter 2 is where B starts. And these are kind of the themes here that are happening in that chapter. There's a power vacuum that's created. And this is important for God putting his purposes together. Okay. And so, Rachel, are you there? Looks like she's trying to jump on here. So we just barely started going through the chiasmus that you and I had talked about. And so basically we're looking at structure part A and B. And I'll just go back really quick so you can see the overview. So here's the overview of that structure. And this is how we're going to read through the chapter tonight. And so wherever you have some insights, you can drop them. I did talk a little bit about some of the symbolism that you saw in chapter 1, which was right here in parts A and B. So if you want to add anything before I move on to where this power vacuum is going to push our story along, let me know. But basically in chapter 1, there were the royal symbols, which you and I talked about, and you pointed out a couple of other things like some textiles. Did you want to say anything about that right now, or do you want to do that at the end? Oh, I can't hear you. Can you guys hear her?
I can't hear her.
I can't hear you. Okay, well, I'll go ahead and push forward onto the next slide, and maybe Rachel can figure out what's going on there with her microphone. If you have to, Rachel, try using Google Chrome, because I had that problem. Like last week, we had all kinds of weird problems.
Right.
And I noticed an issue with Microsoft Edge. So maybe the browser was a problem. And then just make sure when you're logging in that you're selecting your equipment that you're connected to on your machine. And if that doesn't work, try using your phone instead of your laptop. Okay, so the next part here is we're in kind of like Esther chapter 2, verses 1 through 20. And it'll kind of go into up to verse 23 because it kind of starts overlapping. This idea is kind of going into part C of that literary structure. And so we have Hadassah becoming Esther. And this name change is important. And do you want to talk, Rachel? Okay, yeah, I still can't hear you. Okay, just start talking when you think you've got it, or text me, or put something in the chat, and then I'll know that you're ready. And so we've got with Vashti removed, the narrative introduces its two covenant preservers. We've got Hadassah or Esther, and her older cousin Mordecai, who had raised her after she was orphaned. And it says that she was orphaned in Esther chapter 2, verse 7. From this point forward, they function almost as a covenant partnership, her and Mordecai. Esther has access to the palace, and Mordecai remains at the king's gate. And so he's like a protector and servant to the king. Together, God will use both of them in their positions to preserve his covenant people in this empire. Well, the section right here corresponds to point B on our chiasmus of the chiastic structure. Esther receives a royal crown, and on the surface, she appears simply to be the winner of a, I don't know, like The Bachelor. I was like reading this and I was like, this is kind of like the first Bachelor. And it's like all these women are lining up for the king, who's not really a bachelor because he's got tons of wives and concubines, but that's kind of how they play it. It's like The Bachelor. And they prepare them for a year and they do all this anointing and all of these things to make these women beautiful and get them ready for this beauty contest. Basically, it's like a beauty pageant for the king, or The Bachelor is what totally came to my mind. So it looks like she's the winner of this like royal search for a new queen, but the narrator repeatedly tells us that Esther, quote, obtained favor wherever she went. So everyone seems to love her, including the people, the servants who are assigned to her. And nothing miraculous is described, but God's hidden power, his hand, it's already quietly directing the events. And I think that's what the structure is trying to help us see. And so one small detail that's especially revealing is when Esther is brought before the king, and we read in Esther chapter 2. We're going to look at verses like 15 and 17 here, and I'm just going to paraphrase, but it says, Esther obtained favor in the sight of all them that looked upon her, and the king loved Esther above all the women, so that he set the royal crown upon her head. So she basically fills this power vacuum. And verse 15 also notes that she required nothing beyond what Haggai, the servant, recommended. And this was a demonstration of her humility. For those of you who've seen like a lot of the movies about Esther, remember how they kind of show her not taking all the jewels and everything that a lot of these other women are doing. She kind of just adorns herself very humbly. And this is something that those around her take notice of. And so unlike others who sought to distinguish themselves, she actually acts with this humility and wisdom that is what draws, I think, the king to her. And that's kind of the way it seems to be being interpreted through this lens. And so throughout the scripture, God elevates those who trust him rather than those who seek power for themselves. I think this is a common theme we've seen even up to this point. So you see that here too with her. She's humble and she becomes elevated. So the story moves immediately into point C in the chiasm. Mordecai uncovers a conspiracy to assassinate King Ahasuerus, and he reports it through Esther. The conspirators are executed, and the event is carefully recorded in what they call the Royal Chronicles. And if you look at Esther 2:23, it says it was written in the book of the Chronicles before the king. And so this is like a record of these things that happen. The king is like totally unaware of this situation up to now. He'll learn about it later because of this record, the book of Chronicles. So here's another royal object that we can take note of. At first, it seems like an unrelated historical detail, but I promise this is going to help us see the hand of God. So Mordecai, he receives no reward. The story just moves on. It gives this little detail. It's recorded in the book of Chronicles, and then we move on. So there's kind of like this forgotten act of faithfulness that becomes maybe one of those like hidden moments. So if you think of Esther and how her name, it ties her to this idea of hiddenness in the Hebrew version of Esther, which is Hester, which has the connotation of hiddenness. So think about that hidden theme. And there's several of these moments, I think, throughout the book. 4 chapters later, this will become the hinge which the whole story turns on. This is one of Esther's great lessons. God often prepares deliverance long before anyone recognizes the need for it. What appears insignificant today may become the very instrument he uses tomorrow. And there's another pattern worth noticing. Esther's Jewish identity remains hidden up to this point because Mordecai had asked her to keep that a secret. It doesn't really explain why. You kind of get the sense that it's maybe for her protection, but he's just like, just don't say who you really are. She's going by the name Esther, not Hadassah. And so it's kind of like how God's hand and his name is hidden in the story. And so that's another like hidden connection that you can make. But both Esther and God are present in the story, just not by their true name. They're hidden. And they're I would look at it as a revelation, because as we get to the turning point, all things become revealed. So we'll return to that idea later. We're kind of develop this as we go along, but just kind of keep that in mind. Another pattern that you can think about here is Joseph in Egypt. Remember when we talked about Joseph? Esther is really similar because she's an Israelite living in a foreign empire who's elevated unexpectedly to a position of influence, and not for her own personal glory, but so that God can preserve his covenant people, which is very similar to Joseph in Egypt. And then Isaiah also, he later shows us that these stories aren't just isolated events, but they're recurring covenant patterns through which the Lord declares the end from the beginning. And that's what the pattern itself is helping us see. When you have this kind of structure where it mirrors, it's highlighting a pattern that happens in the lives of God's covenant people. Okay, so moving on. Esther chapter 2, verses 21 to 23. This is where structure C starts, and there's a little overlap there. But this is where we have the king's life being saved and the plot to kill the king that Mordecai stops. And so right after Esther becomes queen, what's interesting here is the narrative is pausing. It's pausing to just give almost what seems like a completely unrelated story. It's like, well, what is Mordecai sitting at the king's gate, overhearing this conspiracy with these two royal officers? I think their names was Bigthan and Teresh, and I thought that was just a funny name. And then, but they're trying to assassinate the king. Mordecai tells Esther, if you look at Esther 2:23, it says, and when the inquisition was made of the matter, it was found out. Therefore, they were both hanged on a tree. And it was written in the book of the Chronicles before the king. That hanged on a tree thing is really important too. And this theme's going to come up again later. And at first glance, again, it appears like just a historical footnote. And Mordecai's not getting a reward. He's not being promoted. Nobody even seems to know that this is happening. But I think this is where God is in the details. So just try to think about it from that perspective, because the detail is what will cause the turning point later. And so we can kind of look at how, remember when Joseph in Egypt was in prison and he was faithfully serving in prison, and then he ultimately becomes exalted up to second to Pharaoh. And a very similar pattern is happening here. And it starts with Mordecai's loyalty being recorded before it's rewarded. And it's a very quiet thing that even the king is not aware of yet. And it's similar to what happened with Joseph in Egypt. So just kind of notice that pattern. And I think another important lesson could be that Mordecai, he could have ignored the conspiracy. I mean, after all, he was living in exile under a foreign king. So, like, what does he care? But what I like about this is he chooses loyalty to this king. And Joseph of Egypt did that too in his story with Pharaoh. And even though Pharaoh wasn't part of their covenant, he wasn't a prophet, he wasn't a leader, he had nothing to do with their covenant community, he was still loyal to the Pharaoh. And you see Mordecai doing that here with this king. And so I think that their faithfulness in serving these people who are outside of their own covenant community is something that results in blessings, not just for the people, God's people, but for all the people that are around them. And so think about how maybe like a quiet act of righteousness can become one of those unseen threads through which God preserves his people. And maybe one other final literary observation in this section would be that this last event before Haman enters the story, we see the author intentionally establishing Mordecai's character first. And there's going to be a contrast between the two, but we see Mordecai getting established first before we ever see a conflict between Mordecai and Haman. So you already have a sense that Mordecai is faithful, and he's a covenant disciple who's loyal, he's humble, he has some integrity. And I think that this kind of helps us understand the conflict that follows. It's not just personal. It does become a contrast for us to learn from between covenant faithfulness and what that entails in terms of your characteristics and attributes versus pride, someone who's seeking to get gain for themselves. And so I'd like to actually pause here. Do you guys have any thoughts on this idea of maybe something you've done where you felt that nobody noticed it or thanked you or even knew about it? Maybe serving like a family member, or I don't know.
First of
What
all,
are
can
your
you hear
thoughts?
me now?
I can.
Yeah, we
Yes.
can hear you.
Yay!
Perfect
Yay.
timing.
Sorry, I didn't realize when my husband set up my computer that he set it up specifically to work with this headset, and so
Oh,
me and
well,
my lack of technology knowledge, I'm so sorry.
you're ready for takeoff, Captain.
Yeah,
Okay, take it away.
he's the tech nerd in our family, so
Oh, wow.
Well, let's pause here. Let us know your thoughts. What are you thinking?
you
Well,
repeat
I
the
think
question.
for
Oh,
me,
you got it.
I think for me, it just when I approach scripture now and I look at these stories and these narratives, there really is a lot of applications that apply to our lives. I mean, I can see myself in a lot of these areas and situations. And the one thing I think with regards to Esther is the whole idea of fasting. I mean, I think that's my biggest takeaway is that she she goes into fast, or well, she asks the community to fast, and then she goes into fast with the community. And if I remember correctly, it was because she's trying to figure out here she is. She's an orphan girl, and I didn't really get an understanding of the reason behind her story as why she was orphaned. Maybe it was because her parents were taken away or something happened to them,
Yeah, it
but
doesn't say.
it doesn't give any uh background of what happened to her parents. She's just orphaned. And so it's just amazing how she's brought into this royal court, and then she's standing there in this royal court, and she's there by providence. She's there by purpose. She's there intentionally. And that goes to show that, a lot of times when we think about our lives, sometimes even though we may not realize this, sometimes we are moved into positions or situations where we may actually end up not just being in a place where we receive blessings, but we are probably in that situation where we are to be a blessing to somebody. And sometimes we don't see that. And I think we forget how God really does work in the lives of those of us who truly are in line with his purpose and his will, and sometimes even when it seems like the spirit's quiet and our prayers are not being answered, we still see he moves in those places, and he moves in those sacredness. We may not see it, we may not recognize it for what it is until we actually look backward and we look at, oh, now I can see the marks of his grace. I can now see where his tender mercies were being applied. I can see where he's actually been working with me, even though we think it's because of our own desire and our own willingness, our own resourcefulness. It's just that God is always at work, and sometimes we don't even recognize or see it in our own lives until after the fact. And we look back and we say, it kind of reminds me of the footprints in the sand, where we don't realize that the single set of footprints is the Savior carrying us. And we don't see it in those moments. We don't recognize it in those moments until we take a look back and see and realize, oh, that's when he carried me. Now, I agree with some people that I've seen online where they question about the drag marks, and that's where they say, "Well, that's where God had to drag me." So sometimes I think it's that truth. There's that truth
Well,
too.
in this case, I don't even think that any of these people are being dragged. Like, I think one of the things that's kind of interesting is it's so subtle. It's like
Right,
you would look at this as just ordinary things playing out. There's no mention of God. Again, no parting of the Red Sea, no major miracles happening here. There's not even a prophet in this story. These are
right.
regular people.
It's like the Book
Yeah.
of Ruth. It's like you don't don't see God moving in miraculous ways. There's nothing referencing God. But again, it is going back to, even though we may not see him present, he is present.
And also just like kind of piggybacking on that, when you look at the meaning of some of the names here, how much more comes out of the story that helps us understand what the story really is about, and how we are from a father of lights. Like for
Mhm.
instance, Mordecai, the son of Jair, or however you say that, Jair means light. So he's the son of light. And
Oh,
we
I
know
like that
God
one.
is the God of light. And and then I love what it says here in Esther too, because you were mentioning about her parents and how she was orphaned. And in a way, we were orphaned from
Mhm.
like when Adam and Eve partook of the fruit. In a way, you can kind of think of that as like the first parents or whatever,
Yeah, like
and that we,
covenantally we're
yeah, exactly,
displaced.
yeah, exactly. So there's that displacement, and then it says, just like kind of thinking about that. Um, she was brought into the fortress of Susa. Susa is a word that is referencing, well, like there's that, um, I guess whenever I think of Susa, I think of like the Suez Canal or whatever. It's kind of in that same area.
I kept
But it's
thinking
this,
that too.
yeah, I had this thought. I was like, oh, Suez Canal, Susa. There's got to be some connection there. But anyway, but yeah, she's brought into that place, and so I don't know, kind of like how in some ways the earth is a fortress to us from Satan, because we have the power of God being manifest here in this world for us. So I don't know.
What is that word again?
Um,
Susa,
Susa,
that's the place.
Yeah.
It was one of the capital cities in this
the
Persian
royal harem,
Empire.
the fortress of Susa. Yeah.
Yeah, and there's a fortress in the city. The city itself is a fortress. It's like one of the strongholds in the empire. Okay, so
Yeah.
I'm
Well,
gonna
there.
kind of move
Oh,
on to the next part.
real,
Oh,
real
do you
quick,
have something for two? Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Because when you say, is it Susa,
Yeah. Susa.
Susa? Well,
SUSA is
there,
how they had it.
SUSA. Okay.
And
Well,
sometimes it was
it
called
almost.
Shushan too.
Oh, Sushan. Okay. Well, there's a very close Greek word, sozo, which means to save, deliver, protect, heal, and make whole.
That's kind of a
Yeah.
nice connection. I like that.
Can I
Yeah.
add one more thing too? Unless,
Yeah.
sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt
No,
what
go
you were
ahead.
doing. But along with this, like one of the first things that they do when they bring her into this fortress, and so just kind of going off of this fortress idea, because I was kind of, I don't know. See, like I read the book of Esther, and I feel like it's a story about the restoration. It's a story about the
Mhm.
Latter Day Bride, and we were cut off, and then we're brought into this fortress. Like I don't know if you talk to anybody from Utah, these mountains around us, they always kind of describe it like a fortress. So I kind of think
Yeah.
of that there. Then it said he's prescribed a special diet for her. And I think about the word of wisdom, how like that was kind of like a special diet that was
Mhm.
prescribed for this Latter Day Bride. And so
Yeah, this is all the
and
stuff they're doing to like ready these
and then
ladies.
7 maids. There's 7 maids specifically chosen. 7 is that number, like Zion, like I don't know, so many layers here that we could go into. It'd probably take forever to dissect them all,
So
but
here's what we're gonna do,
that's how I
Rachel,
think
because
of this.
you weren't here at the beginning, but what we're gonna do is we're gonna go through the literary structure, and then I did make a
Okay.
slide for all of those things that you just mentioned. So I made
Oh,
one for
okay.
the
All right.
bride. I made one for the bride symbology, one for the textiles and colors that we talked about, and then one for the royal objects and
Okay.
messengers that
All right.
includes the animals. So you'll be able to hit
Great.
on all that. And then if you
Okay.
check your
I'll read
email
that.
right now, I sent you that so you can kind of scroll ahead and look at that really quick while we're talking
Okay.
if you want.
Great.
Okay.
Perfect. No, that will be very helpful because
And
I'm
then
so sorry I was
so
late.
so what we're doing right now is we're kind of moving through the structure. And yes, if you want to weave in some of those thoughts on the structure or on the acrostic, that's kind of what we'll do. But what we'll do is pull back at the end and give the overview, because just the nature of discussion is like sometimes we forget to say something. And so I just wanted to like kind of do like an overview at the end where we can kind of run through all those symbols and the acrostic. But if you guys think of something, notice how I've got this going in chronological order. So as we move chapter
Yeah.
by chapter, if you see like something in one of those verses and you're like, oh, we should call that out and kind of weave that into our discussion on this little section, do it. but just understand that you can give all the details at the end because I'll have slides to go with it.
Sounds good. No,
Okay.
sorry about that. I kind of came in. I was like, where are we
No, you're
at? I
fine.
feel so bad because
No,
we had
do
some
it
family thing we had
exactly
to
what
deal
you're
with.
doing, like where you see it in the verse. If there's like a verse you want to highlight, do it. And then notice on the slide right here, Rachel, look on here how I have section C is where we're at. We're at structure level C in the chiasmus, and this is what's happening there. And so just kind of follow along. And as we're going, if there's stuff in that
Okay.
that you want to pinpoint, just do it as we're moving through, because then we can kind of talk about it in order, in chronological order.
Sure.
Okay, so the next part that we get to in the chiasmus is we're in chapter 3, and it's most of chapter 3, and it kind of goes into the beginning of chapter 4. And what's happening here is there's this plot of Haman's and this decree against the Jews. And so the story, it reaches its first major crisis for the people. Haman is elevated to become the king's chief official, and everyone is commanded to bow before him. Mordecai refuses. So, kind of like Vashti, he's like, nope, sorry. Well, it says in Esther chapter 3, verse 2, but Mordecai bowed not, nor did him reverence. The text never explicitly tells us why Mordecai refuses, but it is clear that his loyalty to God takes precedence over loyalty to any political power. What begins as one man's quiet act of covenant faithfulness quickly becomes a crisis for the entire nation, though. So Mordecai's act, it actually affects all of his people. Everyone's going to get punished for this thing that he does. So notice Haman's response. It's completely disproportionate to what is happening here. It says in Esther chapter 3, verse 6, he thought scorn to lay hands on Mordecai alone, wherefore Haman sought to destroy all the Jews. So it's like the response that Haman has is so disproportionate to like the act that's being done here. It's like his beef should be with Mordecai, but no, it's not just with Mordecai. He's going to make it with Mordecai and all the Jews, everyone who comes from this kingdom of Judah. Well, his wounded pride grows into a collective hatred for the people, and one faithful Jew becomes the justification for condemning an entire covenant people. That is Mordecai. The narrative also identifies him repeatedly as Haman the Agagite, and we're going to talk about Haman's name. His name, the etymology is a little bit unclear, but one of the things that it links to is the Hebrew sound Hama, which means to rage. And you do see that theme here with Haman, which is kind of interesting to consider. And we'll talk about some other considerations for his name coming up as we pull back. So whether understood historically or literarily in the structure, the title of Haman the Agagite, it recalls ancient Israel's conflict with Amalek. The story isn't just about Mordecai versus Haman. It becomes kind of like another chapter in the continuing recurring conflict between God's covenant people and those who seek their destruction, which is what the Amalekites represent. And Haman is possibly descended from these people. That's what the Agagite title is helping us understand. So before approaching the king, Haman casts pure. It's a lot. And this is to determine the most favorable time. He's leaving it to chance to carry out his plan against the Jews. You see that in Esther chapter 3, verse 7. And later, the Feast of Purim will get its name from this event. And ironically, the very symbol that Haman uses to determine Israel's destruction becomes the name of a celebration that continues to this very day in Israel about their deliverance. And so it's just kind of funny how this thing that signified death becomes a symbol of deliverance. And this is that reversal pattern that we're seeing. And so anyway, it says in Esther 3:13, Haman, he persuades the king in this way. He says, to destroy, to kill, and to cause to perish all Jews in one day. That's his goal. The decree, it actually gets translated into every language of the empire, and it's sealed with the king's signet ring. So here's another royal object that we're seeing, and it's sent by royal couriers throughout the 127 provinces. And so this is it's a symbol of the king's power and of I would say maybe the speed at which these decrees are going out and the great effect that they have. Also, I think something that you can notice here is how the king literally just gives his signet ring to Haman. And it seems to me like the way I would characterize the king is that he has all this power, but he lacks wisdom, discernment. He doesn't seem to like think it through. And he's constantly delegating a lot of power to people. And I look at that as reckless behavior personally. I don't see him really being a faithful king to his people. It's like he's not really seeking their protection. So that's maybe something to note about him. I think the chapter closes with a very remarkable contrast. So if you look at like Esther chapter 3, verse 15, it says, "And the king and Haman sat down to drink, but the city Shushan was perplexed." While the rulers celebrate, the people are thrown into confusion. Mordecai tears his clothes, puts on sackcloth and ashes, and mourns openly in the streets over this decree. The people are like, what? Why are we being destroyed? At this point, the narrative appears that for the people, all is lost. They basically have two choices: get out of the empire or die, or face your death. And so I think the structure itself, it's kind of like quietly reassuring us at this point. When we get to point D in the chiasm, we see it's not the end of the story. The decree of death will eventually be answered by a decree of deliverance. And before that reversal comes, though, this crisis has to reach its climax. So the covenant people, they're under this sentence of death, and this sets the stage for Esther's act of faith, which we will get to here. Do you guys have any thoughts on chapter 3?
I guess I'm getting kind of like Job vibes that kind of come to my mind with how like at the beginning of Job, he allows Satan to basically like destroy Job's life.
Yeah.
I kind of feel like that's the same thing with that covenant ring being given over to Haman. Hamas. I always think Hamas. I wonder if there's got to be a similar root structure there somehow that connects. But it's just, I don't know, that just kind of what came to mind is it's like this is the same story, playing out in different.
Yeah, that's actually
told a different way.
It's a good thing to point out because Job is going to be the one that we do next. So that's a good point. So as we move into chapter 4, this is where we see a lot about Esther. And I know Tim's going to have a couple things to say on this. So let me just set up the chapter. And then maybe we can kind of look at the acrostic, because right here we're at structure level E, where we have Mordecai and Esther's plan. So you've got Haman's plot, and now we're going to have Mordecai and Esther's plan to counter that. So the decree's gone out. Humanly speaking, there's no solution here. Nobody has power to change this. The laws of the Medes and the Persians, they can't be revoked. That signet ring was used. Esther hasn't been summoned by the king for 30 days, it says. So there's that number 3. Remember, with the Hebrew numbers, 30 represents often like, it can be like a month, a season. It can be part like a point in a trial. You have the number 3, so it represents everything 3 implies, and then you times that by 10. So there's a lot of ways to look at the biblical numbers. I'm just going to say that here. We can look at that later, but just take note that she hasn't been summoned for 30 days, she said. So a whole month's gone by and this king has not paid any attention to her. So she feels powerless, is what we're understanding. Mordecai sends Esther one of the most memorable questions in all of Scripture that I think everybody who knows the story of Esther knows this. But in Esther chapter 4, verse 14, it says, "Who knoweth whether thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this?" Rather than acting immediately, Esther first calls the covenant community to seek the Lord together. This is what Tim was talking about with the fast. And so here's the chapter where we see that. And she says in chapter 4, verse 16, "Go gather together all the Jews, fast for me, neither eat or drink 3 days, night or day. And also my maidens will fast likewise," she says. Well, this is interesting because imagine not eating and drinking for 3 days. Most of the time, 48 hours without water, you'd be like dying. You're like, you can't even get up out of bed at that point. So, oh, yeah, that's a good one. Thanks, Thomas. Yeah, so we have a biblical numbers slide towards the end where we'll pull that up. But take note because there's a lot of numbers going on here. And I do think that when you see that, you can think about the symbolism, but try to put it in the context of the literary structure to help you come away with the interpretation. Right here, you have this time period. I love that wisdom connection because what you see here is Mordecai and Esther, they are trying to figure out in a wise way how to deal with this, and they turn to God. And so the fast represents them turning to God. So notice the order of events. The story deliberately pauses before Esther enters the king's court. Courage is preceded by consecration. Before she seeks the favor of this earthly king, she first seeks the favor of the king of heaven, right? Like that's where she's going first before going before this worldly king. And I love that because I think in that is the wisdom demonstration. So maybe that 30 connection that Tomas made, maybe that is a way we can like kind of mentally make that connection. That was really beautiful. I love that. Thank you.
Can I mention something here that just came to mind? There's
Mhm.
almost a chiastic structure too with the food. Like she had a banquet prepared, they were given a special meal, and then there's a fast, and at the end she prepares the banquet for the king and for all these,
Haman.
for Haman. So
Yeah, it
it's
was the
just
king
kind
and
of
Haman.
interesting how there's this fast banquet, like there's that same V structure.
Yep. No, it is. And actually, go back here and you see that here because you have like the chapters, they do take note of the banquet. And if you go to my high level one, this was the one you weren't here for, but look here, there's a feast and Purim, which is also a feast. And then you have here first banquet in level F and then second banquet. So there is definitely a parallel there. It is a chiasm. And so you'll see that symbol. That's a good catch, Rachel, because you weren't here for that slide. So you caught that one
But
on
like
your own.
what it means though is so profound, because like what that says to me is that we had the banquet. We were in heaven with Heavenly Father. And then we're here. It's almost like a fast away from his presence. Like we are in some way, like in some ways we are fasting from the presence of God, that banquet, that feast, that bread and water, and then we will be joined back, and not only that, we will be preparing banquets for others, like it's just like I just kind of feel like that's the commission. We become reborn, and then we help others get reborn, after that. I don't know. It's just that's kind of what it speaks to my mind here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I love that. Yeah, and I think that is how we want to try to look at it. Whenever you see one of these structures, it should provoke those thoughts and help you, try to make those connections. So here we've got Esther who's calling a fast. So she's seeking the King of Heaven. And throughout scripture, fasting is consistently associated with drawing near to God, seeking his will, receiving revelation, obtaining spiritual strength, and pleading for divine deliverance. And I had studied several different gospel topics on fasting for this just so that I could try to tie in a lot of the symbolism. There's a lot in the Book of Mormon, so let me just give you a few. So remember in Ezra, he proclaimed a fast before leading Israel safely home. That was in Ezra chapter 8, verses 21 through 23. We talked about a little bit of this last week, the things that these people were doing to prepare. Well, Alma, he testified that he received his witness after fasting and praying many days. It said in Alma 5:46. The sons of Mosiah prepared for their ministry through, it says, quote, much prayer and fasting in Alma 17:3. And Isaiah taught that the fast the Lord has chosen breaks bands of wickedness, lifts burdens, and brings light after darkness. You can look at Isaiah 58:6-12. And that was one of the scriptures that the lesson linked to. And so there's this beautiful contrast that's unfolding, I think, between Haman and Esther as much as Haman and Mordecai. So you've got Haman who casts Pur or the lot in an attempt to determine the future through chance. Now, a lot is like a stone, and this totally made me think of like bread and stones and like the God who gives not stones, but gives bread. And it seems like a stone is being given here to these people, but it's really bread. So I need to think about that. That's kind of like a New Testament connection, but just kind of think about that because I think there is maybe some symbolism going on there with the stone versus the bread, and we have this fast. So they're fasting, seeking the Lord's direction and his wisdom. And so Esther goes before the king of heaven and like takes this to him. And so she doesn't respond with chance, right? Like Haman, he's casting lots and letting chance determine the day that he's going to make this decree be for these Jewish people to be destroyed. But Esther, she doesn't leave it to chance. She puts this in God's hands. And so I think there's an interesting contrast there. And she does that through the act of fasting. Fasting is the demonstration of her faith, where she's signifying to God that she's placing the outcome entirely in his hands. So even though God's name isn't mentioned here, the fact that they're calling a fast and petitioning God for deliverance and help on this matter shows us that God is present and that he is in these details. And I love this idea of chance, like leaving it to chance, which is such a worldly approach, even like a superstitious approach versus like true direction and giving it to God. The numbers in the narrative also reinforce this pattern. Esther has waited 30 days, it said, without being summoned. A prolonged season of uncertainty is what's happening here. There's this season of uncertainty. Then she calls for this 3-day fast, and it's on the third day that she enters the king's presence. It says in Esther 5:1. So throughout scripture, the third day often marks God's intervention after a period of testing. Abraham reaches Mount Moriah on the third day. Jonah emerges after 3 days. Christ rises on the third day. After 3 days of darkness in the Americas, the resurrected Savior appears to the Nephites. So here again, we've got the third day becoming a turning point from this impending death toward the deliverance. Esther's confidence ultimately rests not in her position as queen, but in the God whom she sought through fasting. And the great reversal of the book begins not in the throne room, but in the fast. The same
Right.
principle continues in our day. And so some examples we had, remember you guys when President Nelson invited the world to unite in fasting during the COVID-19 pandemic? He actually called 2 worldwide fasts. And he
That's
was seeking
exactly what I
relief and
think of
healing.
when I think of this in Esther. I think of it all the time. It's got to be a connection.
Well, and then recently, President Oaks, he invited the whole church to unite in fasting for gratitude and for the strengthening of religious
fast.
liberty. And so
3
I
days
think
of fasting.
in every generation, prophets are calling us to fast. God's people,
Right.
we always respond to crisis with fast. Like we were having fires over here that were like coming over the hill towards the little neighborhoods that are just across the way from us. And our whole state fasted. And right after the fast, it
Wow.
was like the next day we had rain and it put out that fire on the
Beautiful.
hill. So fasting for deliverance is definitely a theme. And I think Esther teaches that fasting is more than just like abstaining from food. It's actually the act
Right.
of faith. It's like what we demonstrate, that how we show God that we're giving it to him, that we're putting our lives in his hands. So I don't know, do you guys have any other thoughts about
Well,
fasting?
did you want me to go over the acrostic?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
So so when we're looking at this and we're understanding this, the acrostic again is actually Esther. And so when we look at E, it's embrace your divine placement. So looking at Esther 4, verses 13 through 14, who knoweth whether thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this? So Esther did not choose the circumstances that shaped the beginning of her life. She did not choose to lose her parents, live as part of a displaced covenant community, enter the Persian royal court, or become queen under such complicated circumstances. Yet Mordecai helped her recognize that her present position might involve more than personal advancement or royal privilege. She may have come into the kingdom at the precise moment when her influence may be required to preserve the lives of others. Like you mentioned, this is paralleling that we see with Joseph in Egypt. So divine placement does not always mean that every painful circumstance was directly caused by God. It means that God is quite capable of meeting us in our own circumstances. We may not have chosen and transforming them into opportunities for covenantal faithfulness. Our own history may explain where we've been. However, it does not disqualify us from what our Heavenly Father is asking us to do. Esther's orphanhood did not cancel out her purpose or even her influence. Her exile did not place her beyond God's reach. Her position within a pagan empire did not prevent her from becoming an instrument of deliverance. And so when you think about this, sometimes we search for our purpose and meaning in distant places while overlooking the people already standing before us. Our family, congregation, community, fellowship, recovery community, workplaces, friendships, our ministry responsibilities, and even our own personal wounds may place us near somebody we are uniquely prepared to reach. The question is not only where would I rather be, it is also whom has the Lord placed within my reach where I am in that moment. Embracing our own divine placement means becoming spiritually attentive to the responsibility hidden within our present circumstances. And then,
Yeah.
as we see, S is seek the Lord through fasting. So here, going carrying over to Esther 4, and then the next two verses, 15 through 16, go gather together all the Jews and fast ye for me. And what I see here is a lot of intercessory going on. She's asking people to fast as a means to intercede. And then she goes into fast to intercede on behalf of her people. So she did not rush from fear directly into action. So before entering the presence of the king, she called the Jewish community in Shushan to unite in fasting. She and her attendants fasted as well. The crisis was personal because Ezra's own life was at risk. It was also communal because the lives of her people were being threatened. Therefore, she refused to face the moment through political position, personal charm, or even human strategy alone. She sought spiritual strength through collective sacrifice and dependence upon God. Fasting is never a way to manipulate the Lord into granting our desires, and it was not a way to manipulate the Lord into granting Esther's desired outcome. She entered into a purposeful time of fasting as an expression of humility, surrender, unity, and trust, recognizing she was not able to control how the king may respond. She was able to prepare carefully, approach with courage, and make her requests with wisdom. Yet she had no guarantee that the golden scepter would be extended. Fasting helped her move from the illusion of control into faithful dependence because it prepared her heart to do what was right, even when the results remained uncertain. So, here,
Mm.
when we look at the lesson, it connects Esther's fast with trusting and relying upon the Lord. So, our most important decisions ought to never be powered by mere anxiety, urgency, or emotional reactiveness. They are moments when we are to pause, gather spiritual strength, seek personal revelation, and invite trusted individuals to fast and pray with us. Fasting does not ever remove responsibility, it prepares us to carry out that responsibility given with greater humility. And then we have T, taking courageous action. And so Esther's fast eventually had to become necessary. Spiritual preparation was not a substitute for stepping into the inner court because Esther understood the danger clearly. Anyone who entered the king's presence without being summoned may be subject to death. Unless the king extended the golden scepter, she did not deny that risk, minimize the consequences, or even pretend that she was unafraid. After the fast, Esther put on her royal apparel, entered the court, and stood where the king could see her. The king then extended the scepter, and Esther was permitted to approach. And so, courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is the decision that faithfulness matters more than fear. Esther's declaration, if I perish, I perish, was not reckless despair. It was the surrender of the outcome after she had prepared herself spiritually and accepted her responsibility. She could not know whether she would survive, but she knew that silence would leave her people exposed. Courage meant moving forward without possessing complete control over what would happen next.
I like how you made the connection between the fast and like she doesn't have control over the situation.
Right,
But what I think is interesting about the fasting is it gives you control over your body, over your
right,
response. And
right,
I think that's so interesting because like okay, guys, like today was Fast Sunday, right? And I was like totally fasting, and I actually hate fasting because it's really hard for me. I have blood sugar problems, and so like it's really difficult for me to do it. And all day I was feeling very fatigued, and so I was up really late last night working on this, by the way, so hopefully this is a good one because I slept till like 4 o'clock in the morning, so I was really tired.
The slides
And
are
so
beautiful.
Busio family, I've got more for you. Don't go anywhere. We have tons of really cool slides coming up. Thank you for taking note of that. I appreciate that because we put a lot into this. We really like this story of Esther. It is a short story, but there's a lot here. And I like how you made that connection between like the fast and like it gives her, I think in the story, at least the way I was reading it, it gives her like a sense of peace. It's like no matter what the outcome is, she has that inner peace. And I think that's the peace that the
Yeah.
Savior brings, right? Like that's the peace that he gives that the world can't give you. And
Yeah,
putting it
it's
in God's
accepting.
hands gives her inner
Right.
peace, but Haman put it in the world's hands and left it to chance. And look at
Right.
how crazy he gets in this.
Right.
I had an
Well,
experience that connects to that really well about the control thing, because I
mhm,
think that what fasting does, even though it doesn't, like, we don't have any control over the situation, it gives us in some ways a sense of control, because in a way it's like we're able to petition God. But like, I have a lot of worries that are in, I mean, we all have worries in our life, but I was at the temple the other day, and I was, I went there taking my worries to the Lord. And normally I do this session, and then I, sit in the celestial room for a little bit and then pray. Well, this one I was in there for like over an hour. I was in the celestial room for over an hour, just really trying to get answers and everything. And, but in being there, I was like pouring out my heart, and getting nothing. And finally, it was like time where I'm like, I really need to get home. So I was like, well, I guess you don't have anything for me today. And I was kind of feeling that disappointment. But then the words came into my mind that, well, this is what I was told: don't bring me your worry, bring me your peace. And I was like, what?
Well,
And
that's
so I was
interesting.
pondering on that for a little bit. And I was like, here I had been expressing to the Lord everything of my fears, but how was I expressing it? I was expressing it with fear. I was expressing it with worry. I was not expressing it with confidence, with faith, with peace.
mhm,
And I think that's important for us to remember. Like, yes, we're going to be expressing to the Lord all of our fears and worries with the most fear and worry that we can, give sometimes, especially in scary situations. But if we can remember to give that with confidence, with
right.
knowledge that God will intervene, and if we can come to him, to the throne of grace with that attitude, I think a lot of things will start to fall into place with that control, and that's the power really of fasting and prayer.
Yeah, I like that. So let's see, what slide are we on? 9. And I've got probably, let me see really quick here where we're at, because we're kind of taking a lot longer to go through these than I thought we would. We're almost to the halfway point. Um, Let me try to get through like a couple more of these literary layers. And then at
Right.
the end, let's pull back and do like the big overview because we have all of those symbol slides that we can kind of look at the symbols that were in here. So the next section is Haman's gallows. This is that structure F on the chiasmus. On the third day, immediately following the fast, Esther enters the king's inner court. Instead of condemning her, the king does extend his golden scepter. This is another one of those royal symbols. And this is a really beautiful symbol because it's one showing that her life is spared before she even speaks. He's extending her life. And I just think that there's some beauty there. What wilt thou, Queen Esther, and what is thy request, says the king? It shall be given, or it shall be even given thee to half of the kingdom. So he's saying, whatever you want, I'll give you even up to half the kingdom. So you see the love that he has for her. He recognizes her as humble and faithful, and he extends that life, that scepter of life. Remarkably, Esther doesn't immediately reveal Haman's plot. Instead, again, wisdom patience, all of these qualities are being displayed here, but she invites the king and Haman to a banquet. And remember, in the chiasm, you've got banquet 1 paralleled with banquet 2. And it's interesting that she doesn't, even at this first banquet, say what the plot is. It's almost like what's happening is God is giving patience to her and to the people. And it's almost like God knows Haman's, what he's thinking and what's going on in his head. So think about his ego. Think about how this delay actually affects Haman's ego. Because this is the thing that I was noticing because of the structure, because of the literary structure. So his ego's going, and he's like, oh, I'm elevated so high. He doesn't understand that there's a connection between Mordecai and Esther. He doesn't know that Esther's name is Hadassah and that she's Jewish. He has no idea who she is. He just knows she's this beautiful queen that the king propped up. And I don't even think he sees her as a threat, because look at what happened to Queen Vashti. So Haman's ego is really rising here. So her restraint compared to his ego is what's interesting. It's very fascinating to compare their qualities, how she's exercising wisdom, diligence, patience, and he's just like, oh, I gotta get the highest seat in the palace. Look at me, the king's elevating me. I get to go to a banquet with the king and the queen. He tells his wife, he tells his friends, and then he's also complaining about Mordecai the whole time and all the Jews. And it's very interesting. So whether, I don't know if it's wisdom from God that she's experiencing, or it's the inspiration, I think you can link it to the fast, the fact that she decides to set up these 2 banquets. It doesn't directly say that, but this is the decision she comes to after the fast. So she's refusing to like rush forward and say, king, Haman's going to kill me. She actually waits, and it turns out to be like the total right decision, because then Haman can't deny anything. She basically lets him hang himself. Okay. So meanwhile, while this little contrast between Haman and Esther is getting increasingly sharp, we've got Esther, who spends the 3 days fasting, versus Haman, who spends basically the time celebrating himself.
Right.
But we also have Haman experiencing, it's like with all the celebrating that he's doing, if you notice, he also can't enjoy his wealth or his position or his influence, because he's focused on his hatred of Mordecai. And so it says, he even says in Esther 5:13, he says, yet all this availeth me nothing, so long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate. So do you see how his like obsession with this thing that he perceived as a slight by Mordecai is actually hurting his ability to be happy for the things that he's obtained? It's like he can't even find happiness in the wealth and the prosperity that he's experiencing.
The story reminds me so much of Othello and like Shakespeare. It's like Shakespeare. This whole thing is so fun.
Well, it shows how pride, especially when it comes to resentment, that when we get locked into resentment, it's it becomes tunnel vision. We get so locked in and zero in on the hurt, on the betrayal, on whatever it is this person may have done or may not have done, and there's some injustice, and we demand justice. We demand that there is some type of retaliation or some type of compensation, or that we're entitled to some form of validation. Like, you hurt me, so you need to apologize.
He seeks it from his wife and his friends. It says in there, whatever the verses are, but he actually talks to his wife and his friends about it, and they're the ones who give him the idea to build the gallows. And it says 50 cubits, approximately 75 feet, is what that would come out to for Mordecai. They're like, build Mordecai a gallows and let's get him hung. And so he is seeking validation, and he gets it from his people, his little support crew. And there was
a narcissist.
No, he is a narcissist.
Major.
That's what's happening. So
it's just funny thinking about this in terms of some of the things that happened in the news this week. I'm just like, whoa, the similarities. I don't want to name names, but
I think history repeats itself all the time. There was something that was kind of interesting that you guys might think is interesting historical context here, but I actually looked this up because just the Hebrew word is I'm not sure if gallows, like the way we think of a gallows, is what it is. And so I did a little research on this, and I did find some scholarly commentary. So basically, what I found out, and I'll just make a long story short here, but although the English translation, it often says that Haman was hanged on the gallows and that he built this gallows, many scholars actually believe that the Persian practice was more likely impalement upon a wooden stake. And the Hebrew verb talah means to hang. And so it could be describing or displaying, like the displaying of an impaled body on a tree or a stake. And the Persian
Interesting.
relief that I put here, that little relief that you see there, do you see the little brown relief? It's displaying that practice that they had where they would impale enemies publicly as a sign of judgment and disgrace. And so that might actually be the gallows that it's talking about, this 75 foot, basically a giant stake, and they would stake them and then
Right.
leave them hanging there. And so
So
that might be what it was. It might not have been like the rope thing that we would think of.
yeah, that kind of reminds me of Vlad the Impaler, of what he would
Yes,
do
it's
to
more like that.
the enemy army.
Yeah. Well, I think what's interesting is that, like, whether it's translated as hanged or impaled, the narrative is emphasizing a reversal of Haman's plot,
Right.
because what the device that Haman builds for Mordecai is what he ends up being killed on. So there is a really interesting reversal here. I think it's just, I don't know, it's the literary artistry that I'm trying to show. It's very, very well, like, narrated and structured. And so that you're able to identify very clearly that there's God's hand in this and that there's a reversal. And so when we get to chapter 6, this is the pivot. This is the turning point. This is like just before the verse that we've identified in the structure as the turning point, which is chapter 6, verse 10. And so we're on parts G and H here. And this is where we kind of do see how God's timing and his hand is in the details. So right here, the story is going to slow down dramatically, and every detail right here will matter. So for example, the king can't sleep, very important detail. And yeah, the Persians do not mess around. Yeah,
Yeah.
and you guys, the poetry here is going to be interesting, right? Because like Haman's the one who ends up getting impaled, and so do his sons. So we'll get to that. But yeah, this is it's brutal back then. That's all I can say. Brutal. These people.
Yeah, it was not it was not an
I would
easy
not
one.
want to be a woman back then. So the king can't sleep. This is really important. This is a turning point. Instead of entertainment, he actually asks for the royal chronicles to be read. So you saw him in chapter 1, and he's like drinking wine and partying with his friends. And this seems to be very characteristic of him. He's constantly giving away his signet ring, like, oh, here, you go take care of that. Here's my ring. And he's just, in this part, he's like, I don't know, something comes over him, and I would attribute this to the fast that Esther did. This was like what I think the literary structure is trying to show, is that this is all connected to the fast, to putting it in God's hands. And so anyway, this king, he starts out this kind of reckless guy, and then he has this shift where you see he can't sleep, and he instead of partying or drinking wine or asking somebody to bring him some tea to calm his nerves, he's like, can you bring me the chronicles? And so they do. They bring him the royal chronicles. And this is so key. This is where that little detail about Mordecai's act being recorded in the chronicles becomes important. So instead of like a random page, he could have read any page, right? The record of Mordecai's forgotten act of loyalty is the thing that is read aloud. And instead of postponing the matter, the king immediately asks, it says in Esther 6:3, what honor and dignity hath been done to Mordecai for this? He's like, what? Mordecai saved my life and I didn't even know? And he's like, have we honored him? Have we dignified him in any way? And the answer surprises him. They say there is nothing done for him. Well, at that exact moment, and again, this is where that wisdom and patience is so crucial to this story. This is where you see God's hand in the details, where Esther and Mordecai and all the Jewish people put this to the Lord, and look at what happens. Okay, Esther's patient. She responds according to the inspiration that she receives, and it pays off right here. So it says that Haman enters like this outer court. He's intending on asking permission to execute Mordecai, okay? Because he had just talked to his wife and his friends. They're like, go ask the king, if you can hang Mordecai and tell him what he did, that he didn't bow down to you. And at the moment that Haman approaches the king to ask this, the king had just read how Mordecai saved his life. So that act of service that Mordecai did, that quiet, faithful act that nobody recognized, now becomes a blessing that will reverse a curse that's about to come because of Haman. And this is so powerful to me. And for me, this was like a huge moment where I was like getting emotional, because I was just like, wow, God is in the details. And I think that from a literary standpoint, this is one of the greatest examples of hidden providence in scripture that I've ever noticed. And I think that none of these events by themselves appear to be miraculous, but together it shows that God quietly overturns an entire story. He changes the outcome. And this is where I
And
would
he does
also
it through quiet means.
He
He
does.
does it with the scripture. I mean, you kind of think
Yeah.
of the Chronicles as scripture. He does it through quiet means. He's able to change the mind of a king. And I mean, it's like, it almost reminds me of those kings that get saved, and like, it's because they read about the story of Jesus, which is the story of Esther and like Mordecai saving him from these other two. Like, there's so many Christ parallels here. It's crazy.
There are. She is definitely a Christ, like a type of Christ, and we should see her
Right.
that way. We should
And
definitely
we
be
see
reading that.
Mordecai and we see the king, and like they all fit in this role in certain ways. It's so
They
cool.
do. I think that the way I would view it is collectively. So, like in the book of Isaiah, and I cannot wait to talk about Isaiah because I could talk about it for hours and hours. But there's something similar happening here in Esther that happens there. And what's happening is the structure, the literary structure itself, what it's doing is it's taking acts of all these individuals and it's doing a contrast. And what that does is it helps you see a servant of the Lord and what that looks like, a type of Christ and what that looks like, and a servant of chaos and destruction and what that person looks like in comparison. Isaiah is going to do the exact same thing. Okay, so there was something else on this one that I thought was kind of interesting. So the chiastic structure that we've been following, which is that one that was adapted from David Dorsey's, it places Esther 6:10 at the center of the book. And then that other pretty well-known analysis that shifted the emphasis slightly earlier. So it was highlighting Haman's pride in verses 6-9 as the narrative climax. I think both of these observations have value because the first one emphasizes God's active reversal as the climax, and the second one emphasizes the human condition that makes that reversal necessary. And so when the king asks, what shall be done unto the man whom the king delighteth to honor, he's asking Haman. And Haman, he doesn't pause to consider anyone else could possibly be who the king's talking about. He's so high on his little kite that he's just like, yeah, that's me. So here's what I'm going to say. And he's like, oh yeah, give him the robe and the royal garments and walk him around and all this stuff. And then the king instead, so the narrator, he kind of lets us into Haman's private thoughts. It says, to whom would the king delight to do honor more than to myself? So this is Haman's thought that we get some insight on. Well, that sentence reveals what's in his heart. And so I think where God is in the details is God knows our hearts, right? He looketh on the heart. Well, we see that in the story. And Haman's world, it revolves around himself. He's definitely a narcissist. He's very consumed by his own importance.
Self-absorbed.
Yes. And he's imagining the king honoring him. And he's assuming that he must be talking about me because I got invited to this and that. And look at how I'm rising in the kingdom. And ironically, he's completely unaware that the king has spent the whole night thinking about Mordecai. And so the contrast is really, it's kind of funny. It's ironic, but it's just the interesting way in which the irony, I don't know, I always feel like the irony is where you see God's hand. That's kind of my take. Every time you see an ironic situation, look for God's hand because it's right there. And I think he has a sense of humor. I don't know. That's kind of how I picture God anyway, that he might have a little bit of an ironic sense of humor. And so Mordecai's faithful service, it was forgotten but it's remembered through the Chronicles and through God, who clearly is working on the king here through this memory that got recorded of something that Mordecai did. So Haman's pride, it like blinds him to the point that I think we're seeing his pride narrowing his vision, and we're seeing how humility enlarges your vision, right? Because Esther and Mordecai are seeking God, and they're very humble, and their vision is being enlarged. They're experiencing patience and like carefulness in their decision making, whereas Haman is being more
Yeah.
reckless in his decision making. And
Well,
so
when you think about it, what is the greatest sin that has occurred? And it's spiritual rebellion. And spiritual rebellion comes by way of pride. And so to overcome pride, to overcome spiritual rebellion, we have to make sure that we are in a place of being humble. I've been spending the last week working on this new devotional that I've been doing, um, and this is what comes to mind as we're talking about this, is because there is a section that I talk about because it's going through Second Peter, but there's a section where I talk about how when the crisis is over, when we get through the storm and the crisis is over and we now are at peace, we are now, you know, in this place of calmness. The longer we're away from that crisis, the more prone we're to forget what has happened. And then we
Yeah.
begin to romanticize. We begin to, so for those who are in recovery, those who are struggling with addiction, it is often said that the furthest you are from your last use or your last destructive behavior, the closer you are going back to it. And that is so true, because we start forgetting the consequences. We start forgetting the pain. We start forgetting the wounds. We start forgetting the brokenness. We also forget how God intervened, how he rescued us from that mess, how he met us in those moments. And that's how sneaky pride is that it starts sneaking in, and it comes in with the disguise of compassion. It comes in with the disguise of service. It comes in with the disguise of ministering. It comes in all these disguises that are good, that are healthy, that we're supposed to be doing, but it begins disguising itself, because if it were to come in and announce that, hey, I'm pride, I'm here I am coming in like a wrecking ball, we would immediately recognize for what it is. But it comes in luring us in ways that we're comfortable and familiar with, and so when we look at Hammond, we see that this is exactly what's happened. He is focused on his treasure. His heart is upon what he has gained. But even then, it goes further because of his hatred towards the king and what he feels that he is owed to, what he's entitled to. And so we see this pride, we see this spiritual rebellion unfold, and it brings about his own destruction.
yeah, it does. And that actually brings us right to this center point, right? Because the climax is reached now. Haman thinks that he's getting this robe and the horse, and he's getting this honor. And then he's hit with the reality that he's off in La La Land and has no idea what's going on.
I
So
can't tell you how many times I was off in La
Poor
La
guy.
Land.
so Tim, you were talking about how sometimes God has to drag you. Well, it's actually Haman who's getting dragged here, because this is really funny. I cannot read this and not kind of laugh a little bit. I know it's kind of mean, but he was a mean guy. So right here, we're now at the turning point. This is Esther chapter 6, verse 10. And so this is the exact center of the literary structure that we've been following. So after all the waiting, hidden preparation, fasting, the sleepless king night, the forgotten record that gets remembered, Haman's prideful assumptions, and everything turns with one sentence. So we're going to read this slowly, but it says in Esther 6:10, then the king said to Haman, make haste and take the apparel and the horse as thou hast said, and do even so to Mordecai the Jew, that sitteth at the king's gate. Let nothing fail of all that thou hast spoken. So the king's like, yes, great idea, Haman. Everything you just said, go do that to Mordecai. And Haman's like, what? Like, what are you talking about? So this is the hinge upon which the entire story shifts. It's from this moment.
And this part, I feel like with you talking about that patience thing, this part of the story bugs me in a way because of how long it takes for Haman to finally have justice brought to him. Like, I feel like it's like chapters and chapters of like, okay, we know that Haman's guilty. We know that, but when is he going to finally get what's coming to him? And, we kind of get that way with, like,
because you
when is
see him
the wickedness going
celebrating.
to end?
Yeah.
Yeah. Like, it's so frustrating. And then it like talks about how he goes with his friends, it's just like chapters. Whereas the other part of the story, it was like just a few chapters leading up to it. And then it's like, finally, Haman's guilty. And then it's like goes on for very many more chapters until finally all the justice is done to
So
not only Haman, but all of the people who are supporting him.
so here's another thing that
Takes
we
so
need
long.
to
It's that
take note
patience.
of. So take note of what the king called Mordecai. He said Mordecai the Jew. Okay. Now
Mhm.
this is after Haman had already issued the decree to destroy all these Jews on a certain date coming up. It was the
So
13th
he
day of
knew.
Adar. And so the king, I think like the reality may be hitting the king too, that he's like, what have I done? You know what I mean? Like, what have I allowed to happen is really more accurate because he's been so unattentive to what is going on. And he's delegating so much of his responsibility and his power that should be protecting people. And the exact opposite's happening because of his negligence. And so I think that he's realizing this too. That's kind of my take on it because of what he says here, Mordecai the Jew, he's like, oh my gosh, like, what have I done? And so until now, Mordecai has been largely overlooked as a court official, but here his covenant identity is being identified by the king and publicly proclaimed by the king to Haman. And so this man, Haman, he wanted to erase the empire from the existence of all of these Jewish people. Like, he just wants them out of this empire, out of the city. And I think this is why the chiastic structure matters, because without recognizing the literary center, we might naturally think that the climax comes later when Haman dies or when the Jews are delivered. But the author who's writing in this fashion, they intentionally place the turning point here because the reversal begins long before its results are visible. And that, to your point, Rachel, is what's happening, because we need to learn as Latter-day Saints and people who are trying to live by the Spirit how to recognize God's hand and the reversals in our life. And we need to understand that the reversal, God has set it up at the center of the story. Okay.
Right.
Jesus Christ came in the meridian of time. That was our great reversal. So this sentence itself, to me, it kind of changes
Great
everything.
unwinding.
It's like, it is. It's like
it's a great unwinding.
Remember how in the chiasm we have it going down like this is a descent, right? Because it's
The
like
descent
you're
and ascent.
descending and then the ascent, right? So Haman's fall has already begun. He's on his way down in the first half, but Mordecai's exaltation as he's going down because of Haman, he's being exalted. So the reverse is happening. It's like first Haman gets exalted, but spiritually he's going down. So he's exalted in a world sense, but spiritually he's going down. And the opposite is happening with Mordecai and all of the Jews. So this is pretty, I don't know, pretty interesting. Just the Jews' deliverance begins right here at this turning point. And even though nothing visible has happened yet, I think the pattern is highlighting this as the center. So we saw Joseph in Egypt. Remember, he was lifted from prison to Pharaoh's right hand. David, he moved from shepherd to king. He was called long before and anointed long before he ever rose to power. Daniel, he was raised from the lion's den. Christ himself descended below all things before being exalted above all things. And Isaiah, in his 7-part structure, he builds it around this same covenant pattern where the literary center stands. It's the movement from humiliation to exaltation for God's people and the reverse for those who fight against God. And so Esther follows this same theological rhythm. Before the story reaches outward deliverance, it first reaches an inward reversal. And that's what that turning point is. It's that inward reversal that you're not seeing the outcome yet, but the reverse is happening right here. And it's because of all the things that came before, all the preparation and that spiritual work that they did. that led to this. And so what appears irreversible suddenly changes. God's been quietly preparing this moment all along. And this is where I want to introduce an Elder Maxwell quote that we'll talk about at the end. But there was a talk that I read, and there's this phrase that Elder Maxwell used where he says, God is in the details. And he talks about divine orbits. And so I'm going to kind of like end on that note. But I want you to think about the divine orbits in your life and think about how God is in the details of your life. So towards the end of the study,
So
I'll
instead of
pull
the
up
devil
that
being in
quote.
the details, God is in the details.
God is in the details. That's right. And the
I like
sleepless
that.
night, like the forgotten chronicle, Haman's arrival, all of those things, God is in the details. And Haman's pride
Right.
it's like his own destructive force, if you will. So the rest of the chiasmus I kind of condensed because it's basically the same themes but going in the reverse. And so I just have a couple slides here to kind of get us out of the chiasmus, and then we'll go into all of those symbols, and then hopefully we can close up for the night.
Right.
But Haman, so in structure H and G, we've got Haman who takes the robe and the horse, and he arrays Mordecai and has to go through this humiliating act. So there's that humiliation and exaltation. Mordecai becomes exalted, Haman becomes humiliated. And it says in Esther 6, 11 to 12, then took Haman the apparel and the horse and arrayed Mordecai and brought him on the horseback through the street of the city and proclaimed before him, thus shall it be done unto the man whom the king delighteth to honor. So this is very humiliating for him. He has to like parade through the streets and do this. Well, this is like an immediate fulfillment of the turning point. Haman, he spent the entire story seeking his own honor, but then and plotting Mordecai's death, but then he ends up having to honor Mordecai. And just notice the irony, because Haman, he doesn't just like watch Mordecai receive the honor. He actually has to personally clothe him, personally lead the king's horse and honor him. So it's
Yep.
it's like a big slap in the face. It's like everything he wanted for himself, he now has to do to this person who he hated. And then we had also the hidden. It begins to be revealed here, because earlier Mordecai's faithful service was recorded but forgotten. Now it's revealed. And then he was remembered publicly now instead of, just in the chronicles. We've got his loyalty that was once hidden being made to light for all of the kingdom to see. It's proclaimed in the streets of Susa. So that pattern, it appears in the Joseph story when he moves from prison to Pharaoh, Daniel, David, all of those that we just mentioned, and Jesus Christ's own life. We'll see these things. And then we have Isaiah, who we'll look at, where he has a part in, it's Isaiah 49:2, where he talks about how the Lord's servant is hid in his quiver. So you think of the quiver and it's like the bow and the arrow, and it's like the Lord's like secret weapon basically is hidden, and then it gets revealed until the proper moment. And we see that same pattern happening here with Esther and Mordecai, and this concealed identity being revealed. So the king even acknowledged Mordecai the Jew. So if Mordecai be the seed of the Jews, it says in Esther 6:13, thou shalt surely fall before him. It's just an interesting reversal pattern. Well, then kind of like getting to the very end of the structure, now we're in chapter 8, and we see the destruction and the defense. And this is very interesting. So some historical context here is that they were not able to undo or revoke the decree that was signed with the king's signet ring by Haman against the Jews. So what they do to reconcile this is the king again gives his signet ring to Esther and Mordecai, and they write basically an amendment that says that the people can defend themselves against their enemies who come against them on that day. The enemies are allowed to come against them on that day and kill them, but they can defend themselves now, which is very interesting. So when Esther asks the king, okay, when she goes before the king, she's at this second banquet, okay? Haman thinks he's going to go in there and like get this gallows and all this stuff at this second banquet. And it's just so interesting because what ends up happening is like he's the one that gets in trouble here. So let me just set the scene here. Esther in chapter 7, verses 3-6, she said, "If I found favor in thy sight, O king, let my life be given me at my petition and my people at my request. The adversary and enemy is this wicked Haman." So at the second banquet, she doesn't say this at the first one, she says it at the second one. So she's patiently waiting. She calls a banquet. When she goes before the king, they do the banquet. Haman goes off on his little high horse thinking he's so awesome. And then she calls him back to another banquet the next day. And it's at the second banquet that this scene happens where she tells the king, "Hey, Haman's the one that ordered my destruction." The king had no idea who Esther was, but now it's being revealed. So at this second banquet, everything that was hidden is finally brought into the light, and Esther is no longer concealing her identity. She openly identifies herself with these people who she is interceding for that are living under this death sentence. The death sentence was like a year out, by the way, so this is like a year out where this can happen. And notice how Esther carefully prepares for this moment. She didn't begin with accusations, right? She holds off, has these two banquets. She first wins the king's confidence, and she's also building up the suspense. The king's very eager to hear what she has to say. He really wants to know what this is about. Well, she reveals that she belongs to this condemned people according to the law. And only after identifying herself with them does she then expose Haman as the adversary and the enemy who made the law. And you can see how out of touch the king is. It's almost like he doesn't even realize what Haman has done. Well, this is one of those really great deliverance moments where Esther, she has risked her life by standing with her people rather than remaining hidden. Because at this point, she's basically saying, people can come and kill me, king. Like, look at what has happened. Well, the king, he leaves in anger. He goes off to the garden to think about this. Meanwhile, Haman, realizing his fate, realizing that the king is very unhappy with what he's done, he falls before Esther to plead for his life. And so the irony is complete. First, he has to kind of grovel before Mordecai. Now he has to grovel before Esther. So this man who sought mercy from no one, now he's begging for mercy from the very people that he intended to destroy. Well, if you look at Esther chapter 7, verses 9 and 10, it said, "Behold, also the gallows 50 cubits high. Then the king said, hang him thereon." Haman is who he's talking about. So the instrument that Haman had prepared for Mordecai becomes the instrument for his own judgment. When the king came back from the garden, he sees Haman sitting on the couch, and he seems to interpret this as like an advance on Esther. And so the king's like, "Oh, hang this guy, like he's dead." So that's basically what happens to Haman. And in the end, the device that he made for Mordecai ends up becoming his own demise. So this reversal is like kind of coming full force here. And then these are the last levels here. We've got F through A. So although Haman is dead by the end of the story, his decree could not be revoked, okay? The Persian law regarded royal edicts as irrevocable, those ones that were signed with the king's signet ring. And so they issue a second decree authorizing the Jews to defend themselves. That's why the chapter is talking about wars and the Jews fighting people. It's because they couldn't undo what was done. So if people did come up against them on that day, as they were authorized to do, at least now they can defend themselves. Well, there's a great reversal in that too for the people, because the people have all these victories. They're noted in the chapters what the victories are. It gives a lot of biblical numbers. We can talk about that in the coming up slides. But this is also sealed with the king's signet ring. It's carried through the empire by royal couriers, just like that first decree. So everything's paralleling. And the literary structure, it deliberately reverses almost every detail from chapter 3 right here. And so earlier, the couriers carried death. Now they're carrying deliverance. You get to defend yourself. And earlier, Susa was bewildered and in mourning. Now they're like, "Oh, good, we can, we're going to rejoice. We can defend ourselves now. We have a way they have hope, basically." So now Mordecai, he's the one that gets to wear the royal apparel. Esther, the king, he feels terrible for what's happened. So this whole reverse is happening. What's really interesting is the narrative announces the reversal in Esther 9:1. It says the reverse occurred. Well, the Hebrew word there, the verb is, I think it's hafek. It's Haphak, but it means to overturn, transform, or reverse. And it captures the theological heartbeat or rhythm of the book, where God, he kind of like rhythmically overturns the situation for the entire people. And then it concludes with the establishment of the Feast of Purim. And ironically, the festival receives its name from the lot that Haman cast, the pure. And it just goes from their destiny being controlled by chance to their destiny is controlled by God. So Haman, he trusted in lots, but Esther trusted in God. So the political power that Haman had, it avails in no way against them. They're actually able to, they have a lot of success. Haman's 10 sons die. It's like a total reversal by the end. And at the very end, we see in chapter 10 that Mordecai is exalted, second only to the king, just like Joseph in Egypt was. And his people are also exalted. It's like people start converting to Judaism in the kingdom. And perhaps that's because they see the power that these people have. And so the way that this compares to Isaiah, now here's where we're going to start shifting. We're going to zoom out now. We've gone through all the chapters. You can see that literary pattern. So look at Esther's kind of high level overview structure, and then look at over here Isaiah's. So this is using Avraham Gileadi's 7-part structure, that the way that he has it listed in his book. I actually pulled this right out of the book Windows on the Prophecy of Isaiah, but it's in like pretty much every book of his if you've ever read any of his books. This is the 7-part structure in Isaiah. This is what we're going to be studying when we get to Isaiah. And I cannot wait to talk about it because it's cool. It's super cool. And when you understand this, everything else in the scriptures makes sense, I swear. Everything. Even the Book of Mormon makes more sense. So here we are, kind of comparing. Do you guys see the connection? Can you see it? Because one of the reasons that Esther reminds me so much of Isaiah is that both books are built around a literary structure that teaches the same covenant principle. In Esther, the entire story pivots around the reversal of fortunes in chapter 6. The hidden servant is publicly honored. And from that point, everything begins to reverse. Well, the way that Avraham Gileadi writes about the book of Isaiah in his book, The Literary Message of Isaiah, which is like his main scholarly work that he did his master's thesis on. Well, he's one of my favorite scholars because he showed me how Isaiah follows this literary pattern. And the 7-part structure moves from judgment and humiliation towards deliverance through this covenant with Jehovah. And ultimately, it leads to Zion's inheritance in the millennial day. And at the center stands this recurring pattern of humiliation followed by exaltation. And that pattern, it's not unique to Esther or Isaiah. It's actually one of the great themes throughout all of the scriptures. We've talked about Joseph in Egypt. We've talked about David. All of these have that same pattern. And if you read Joseph's story, for example, in Genesis 41, 41 to 43, it says, "See, I have set thee over all the land of Egypt. Pharaoh took off his ring from his hand and put it upon Joseph's hand, and they cried before him, bow the knee." So that same thing's happening here with Mordecai. And so we can see how that theme is replete throughout the scriptures in many, many examples. It happens with King David too. So the parallels with Mordecai, I think, are remarkable. Just this idea of faithfully serving a foreign king and then that leading to an exalted station because they're doing it in the service of God. They're doing it through wisdom. They may be forgotten for a season. You can think about Jesus when he's on the cross and he's like, "Why hast thou forsaken me?" We all feel like we go through these seasons where we're forgotten, but we're remembered at the appointed time. And then we can also have that great reversal and be clothed in royal apparel. And hopefully that's the lesson we're getting when we go to the temple. But Isaiah, he teaches that pattern repeatedly, and the entire book from the first to the last chapter serves that purpose. So does Esther from chapters 1 through 10. And we see that Esther can kind of represent the Zion bride, which we'll talk about here shortly. But if you look at Isaiah 46, 9 through 10, it says, "I am God, declaring the end from the beginning and from ancient times the things that are not yet done." Well, he's highlighting a pattern. So this literary structure is a pattern that repeats over and over and over again. You can see this in church history. You'll see it over and over and over again, and it always reaches like a near fulfillment where there's like a salvation, but the ultimate fulfillment doesn't come until all is said and done. Okay, until the second coming and the millennium are complete. And so, anyway, this is how God teaches the future through the past. These events in ancient Israel's past, when they're structured this way, we can then see that pattern that the Israelites go through will repeat. And that's how you can view Isaiah as an end time pattern because of that structure. And so once I noticed Joseph and Esther sharing the king's signet ring, I couldn't unsee it because Joseph becomes this living pattern that Esther follows, and together they become patterns that Isaiah uses to teach us how God repeatedly preserves his covenant people in times of crisis. And so that's one of the reasons that I love literary structures. It's why I wanted to highlight it. I hope that was helpful and that you guys got something out of that. Here, I wanted to start getting into the high level stuff. So there's a couple of patterns that are happening here that kind of go along with the whole scarlet thread motif that I've talked about. And I know that there's a little bit of confusion because I haven't actually published my paper yet. I'm still trying to finish it and it's going through like editing. But basically the way that I have used this symbol and the way that I'm connecting it is that the scarlet thread is tied directly to preserving the covenant line that leads to Jesus Christ. So the people who are in his ancestry, who are women, they all have a similar story where they're preserving the covenant lineage because of a prophecy that they know about, wherein the Messiah is supposed to come through this certain line. Well, there's a kind of like a parallel pattern to that, and I do talk about this in my paper. It's where women preserve God's covenant people. And they're not directly part of the scarlet thread motif, but they are parallel to it because they're following the pattern, they're modeling the behavior. And they're doing it for a similar reason. It's not to preserve the line where the Messiah will come, but it's to preserve the people, the Messiah's people. And so that's the pattern that Esther fits into. And so anyway, this is just one of those insights that's grown out of my own research. And it's just recognizing that scripture does preserve these patterns. They are consistent throughout scripture. I find them everywhere. And so the first here is what I often call the scarlet thread. When I'm saying that, that's what I mean. And that's that genealogical line like Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, Bathsheba, and Mary. And that leads to Jesus Christ, who's born. They secure that covenant lineage every time Satan's trying to wipe it out. And they stand at critical moments where often the men are failing. So you'll notice that the men are failing around them. They're not doing the job that they're technically called to do, and the women end up doing it. And so Esther doesn't really fit that pattern, but because she's not an ancestor of Christ, she's not focused directly on the Messiah. There's no mention of God in this story. So I would say she belongs to that second pattern that's like a parallel and still important covenant pattern where we've got women who preserve the people and they act as intercessors and stand in danger of destruction of themselves for the sake of the people. So you saw that with Jochebed, Moses' mom, his sister Miriam. They watch over Moses, who ends up being the deliverer. And then you have, remember when Rahab preserves the spies too. So the spies are kind of like the people. So Rahab kind of is part of both. And then you have Hannah. Remember, she raised the prophet Samuel. And anyway, so you have all of these women kind of like helping to not just preserve the Savior's lineage, but also the covenant community, the people. And that's what Esther does. And so each woman, they may serve differently and kind of play a different role, but it's all for the purpose of preserving God himself, Jesus, or his people. And so I think that's just another theme that we can kind of pull out. And then something else that I wanted to mention is, since I brought up Gileadi, in his books, he actually includes Esther among biblical covenant deliverers, and he puts her with Joshua, Deborah, Gideon, David, and Hezekiah. And so the way he talks about her is that she becomes a temporary instrument through whom God preserves his people during a moment of national crisis. And ultimately, this is where you get that Davidic covenant proxy savior theology. And so she's a part of that covenant structure, if you will. And so I think that these people, what they're doing is they're preserving life for a season, and Jesus Christ, he preserves life forever. And so I think those two patterns can just help us understand the Lord and the type of Christ that Esther is acting as in this story. Rachel is going to probably have to jump on her phone because we're almost to her slides. And I guess she was having some trouble with that. But I have like one more here that I can talk about before we get to hers. This is where we have the names as character sketches. So Tim, I sent him an article. He posted it on his Patreon. Tim, you can put
Or
the
on
link
my
in the
website, the link
Yeah.
is the QR code. You can actually scan the QR code up there in the corner, right next to Jessica's head.
right there. There it is.
You scan that QR code, and that will take you to the website, the WordPress website, and it will also, underneath the video that's embedded there, you will also have the downloadable um, for the Google Doc that has the actual acrostic. So I did not get a slide presentation, so there's no resources except for what is already posted there. And you can definitely get that checked out. And
So
like the website,
Tim
drop a
let us
comment.
ladies take the lead on this one tonight. So he like scaled his down. But there's some really good stuff there. And the character sketches are on there too. Hey Rachel, can you just mute when you're not talking, just so it doesn't like do the feedback thing?
Sorry, I forgot that
But
it was
I mean,
muted.
yeah, you don't have to turn off your camera. We can see your beautiful face, but just if like when you're not talking, just mute, and I'll mute when I'm not talking too. But I did include in the article this character sketch, so you guys can get the details there. But basically, this just gives you a little breakdown of the names, and these are just the main characters. There are other names you can look into, like you can look at Haman's wife, you could look at, like Rachel was saying, Susa, and all these different things. But I just focus on the main characters who we were discussing for most of the plot, who all played a major role in the turning point for these people. And the name Esther, I think, is really interesting because it reinforces the hidden identity concept, also her moral choices, and how like the history is being shaped. Oh yeah, so there's Tim. He's got the website up there, and that's where we posted. I wrote like a little. It's just a little paper explaining some of these ideas. The ones that I didn't talk about, that Rachel's going to talk about, are going to be just on the slides. Okay. And I'll have to get the slides into a PDF after we're done, and then I can have Tim put it on there. But for the names, so you've got Hadassah/Esther, right? Because her name's Hadassah, it's her Jewish name, but Esther is the Persian name that she's going by. And so we call her the hidden myrtle who shines. This is how I decided to label her, because Hadassah is the myrtle tree, and then the name Esther is traditionally tied with star in Persian. And so there's kind of like two ideas happening here. So if you look at Esther 2:10, it says Esther had not shewed her people nor her kindred, for Mordecai had charged her that she should not shew it. So she's hiding her identity. Well, her Hebrew name Hadassah means myrtle. The Jewish tradition associates the fragrant myrtle with righteousness, also quiet goodness. And her influence is very quiet, but it produces goodness. And her Persian name Esther is traditionally associated with star, while Jewish interpreters also hear an echo of the Hebrew Hester, meaning hiddenness. So that's where we're deriving all of these meanings from her name. So it's both like a Jewish play on words, and then it's also a just kind of trying to get into the roots. And there's a lot of etymology they're not sure about, but the Persian is often associated with the idea of star. So she's hidden before she shines. She's righteous before she's recognized. And her Persian identity gives her access to the palace, but her covenant identity gives her access to God and his saving purposes. And so we see how Esther, when she says, let my life be given me at my petition and my people at my request, this is where the hiddenness is revealed. And it kind of echoes Isaiah 55:13, where Isaiah says, instead of the briar shall come up the myrtle tree. And that's that. The concept is the reversal. So instead of briars, you have a myrtle tree. And that's the theme in the story. And so there's like an interesting Isaiah connection to Esther's name with the myrtle tree. And so the myrtle itself becomes part of God's great reversal in Isaiah's structure. And it's also in Esther. So there's another connection that you can make between Isaiah and Esther. Now we have Mordecai, who he quietly uncovers the assassination plot, right? Like nobody knows that he saves the king's life, but he does it. It's recorded. He asks for no recognition. He just does his job. Well, then later the king reads it in Chronicles. And so the origin of Mordecai's name, it is debated. It likely reflects his Babylonian Persian setting, while the Jewish tradition also hears an echo. There's like a wordplay there of pure myrrh, the fragrant spice used in the holy anointing oil, which is interesting. And my friend Drake found that one. So I have to give Drake credit for that. He found that actually in like one of those like histories of like names. And so you can tie him to the pure myrrh and the fragrant spice through the wordplay.
That when the three wise men come, one of the gifts is frankincense and myrrh.
Yep. Yeah, it's a holy anointing oil, and these are used in the temple. And so they hear it in his name. It's in the sound of his name, just like with Esther sounding like Hester. So that's where you get the hiddenness idea. And so a lot of these names, they sound very similar. And so even though they may have like a Persian or Babylonian root, if you say it in the Hebrew, the Hebrew sound is where that other idea is being derived. And so his name's foreign. And it reminds us maybe of where history placed him. He's the Jew, right? He got called Mordecai the Jew. So that kind of reminds us of what his true identity is. And so if you notice how the narrative calls him Mordecai the Jew, it's like his covenant identity is actually the stronger identity during his time of exile. And in Esther 10:3, where you see the reversal for Mordecai, it says Mordecai the Jew was next unto the king. So that's kind of interesting that identity kind of stays with him throughout the whole story. And it says, seeking the wealth of his people and speaking peace to all his seed. So instead of seeking his own gain, he's seeking the gain of his people and peace for them. And so there's a real contrast there between him and Haman. So Haman, this is the pride that destroys, right? Even if this proposed connection, by the way, between Haman's name and the Hebrew Hamah, which means rage or tumult, is uncertain, there's still a literary portrait that is not mistakable. It's like you can see what the portrait is that they're painting, and it does fit with that idea of Hamah or rage or tumult. It's the chaos. That's what Haman's representing. So that sound Hamah, it's in the name Haman, even though the name Haman, we're not sure the roots, like the etymology is unclear. But if you just think about what's happening in the story, like so after listing, if you look at Esther 5:11 through 13, after listing his wealth, his children, his promotion, his royal favor, then Haman concludes and he says, yet all this availeth me nothing so long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate. So he is raging, he is feeling tumult. And so it's just kind of interesting that Hebrew wordplay is happening in his name, and that is part of his story. And so like his entire world, himself included, his family, they are all consumed by what this man does. And so
it's almost as if Haman is a type and shadow of Satan.
Yeah, he's like an antichrist.
He's
And when we get to the bridegroom motif, we'll talk about that because he does represent that. Now, I want you guys to look at the king's name too. Ahasuerus or Ahasuerus. I've heard it said both ways, and I'm not really sure which one's correct or if either are. But the king's name, it reflects imperial authority. And the narrative repeatedly portrays a ruler who possesses enormous power but exercises surprisingly little discernment for a king. And rather than speaking with Vashti in the beginning, notice how he turned to his advisors. It's like, she's his wife. He could just be like, oh, she doesn't want to come? Okay, hold on. Let me go check on her. And he doesn't do that. He doesn't go and seek to find out why Vashti doesn't want to come. Instead, he just turns to his buddies and he's like, "Hey guys, what should I do?" And so it's just, I don't know, it's just, to me, it's so immature. It's like the way they paint him, just such a lack of discernment, no wisdom like Solomon going on here. It's like the opposite. And so, anyway, he just seems very impulsive to me. And so, without hearing Vashti's explanation, he actually makes this irrevocable decree that it affects not just his household, but the entire empire. Okay, that's how, like, I don't know, like reckless it is, that the things that
So
he does.
is Xerxes the one that was the god king when we're thinking of
Well,
this?
Xerxes is the Greek for
Yeah,
Ahasuerus. Ahasuerus is the Hebrew for
yeah,
Xerxes.
but I remember when Xerxes was coming against the 300 Spartans, or is
Well,
that a
there's
different Xerxes?
well, there's several. The name is used over and over and over
Oh,
again.
okay,
This is the Persian one, and
okay.
the Greeks are calling him Xerxes, but that wasn't actually his name. It's just in
Ah,
the
okay.
Greek they're translating it like they would say it that way, but it's not actually what his name is. Um, it's this name right here. And so anyway, the king, he asks like no questions. He's just he has this pattern, okay? Like he takes off the ring, he gives it to Haman, then he takes off, he gives it to Mordecai. It's like he keeps kind of doing this like impulsive governing through emotion, and through like his advisors and all these other people that he keeps delegating authority to that really should be his own. And Esther, she never like manipulates him through like deception. She actually, I guess you could say, she manipulates him, but it's through humility. It's like she's not trying to be deceitful towards him or anything like what you saw Haman doing or any of these other people that the king's consulting with. She's just trying to be patient and humble and honoring the king and waiting for that perfect timing, God's timing. And she's trusting in God that somehow he will reverse the situation. And so, ironically, with the king, I think this idea of his name meaning like great authority, he doesn't have discernment to go with that authority. And I think that's the interesting part, but God does. God has the wisdom. He's the ultimate king, right? And then with Vashti, I mean, her name means beauty and dignity, and she represents maybe a defiance. So when Vashti refuses, it doesn't say why. We just know that she's beautiful. Her name is associated with beauty, excellence, and the best. And so there's kind of an ironic thing happening here too, because she's valued for her beauty, but her first defining action is refusing the king. And also perhaps refusing to allow herself to become a public display. You could interpret it that way, and some people do. And so I don't know, one woman's refusal produces this royal fury that turns into a national crisis. And it's just interesting how that upholding of physical beauty leads to a crisis and a power vacuum that needs to be filled. So I think taken together, the names, they become literary portraits. We've got Hadassah Esther, that represents hidden righteousness revealed at the appointed time. And then you've got Mordecai, who represents covenant identity that survives exile and is ultimately remembered and honored. And then you've got this Haman, who represents pride exposes enmity, and ultimately he's consumed by it. And then you've got Ahasuerus, who has this immense authority without any discernment, and he's quietly redirected by God, which is where you see that hand of hidden providence. And then Vashti, the beauty that's joined to dignity, whose refusal unexpectedly prepares the way for Esther. And so the names, to me, they just kind of reinforce the central message that's going on in the story. Their public titles and appearances never tell the whole story, but they become part of the story, if that makes sense. So here's where Rachel gets to shine, because we have some really wonderful things that she picked out in the text. She went through it all herself and highlighted some things, but she was noticing how the author repeatedly uses color, clothing, fabrics, precious materials to communicate covenant themes like royal authority, mourning, deliverance. And you'll see it in several of the chapters. I've noted some scriptures here. So if you want to take it away, Rachel, let us know your thoughts on this.
Are you able to pull up Revelation 17:4 really quick?
Tim,
Because
can
I
you
want
pull
you
it
to
up?
compare this. Because you know, like we've read the book of Revelation. We know that Esther has like some major symbolism to the end times, Like there's a huge connection to the second coming and the millennial
What is
reign and all of that.
Revelation?
Revelation 17, verse 4. And I'm sorry I didn't get this slide to you beforehand. It's been a busy day.
Do you want it in the King James or do you want it in the NRSV UE?
Whatever. King James is fine.
Whatever
Not for
floats your
this.
boat, Tim.
Pick. But if you'll notice, like the way that this is talking about one certain kind of woman, and then you contrast it with these colors that are used specifically in this book of Esther, it's very interesting. So while he's pulling that up, we know that we've got the blue color. Okay, blue color symbolizes heaven. Okay, and white, I was kind of think of as the clouds. There's water, like water vapor is what makes clouds, and that's what purifies you. So I think that's probably why those symbolisms, plus the fact that blue is in the heavens, so those two symbols come out very clearly there. And then we've also got this purple, which it was very difficult to come by. So of course you could only afford it if you were rich. So it's royal
Yeah.
color. And then anyway, just looking at these four colors, if we look at Revelation 17:4,
Yeah, let me get it.
yeah, sorry.
We'll go with
Okay,
the Lexham English Bible version. Here, let me
thanks.
increase that.
So it's talking about how in almost there, yeah, okay. All right, so it talks about how there was a woman, stop there. There was a woman dressed in purple and scarlet and adorned with gold and precious pearls and stone, holding a golden cup in her hands of detestable things. It's interesting because we see purple and scarlet here. But then we go over back to the scriptures here in this that are used in Esther. We see the contrast of the blue, not red. That there's a heavenly royalty to it. We can go back to the slide with the symbols. Okay. We and like Jessica pointed out, we see these colors, in the first part and in the last part. It says, in the courtyard was beautifully decorated with white cotton curtains and blue hangings, which were fastened with white linen cords and purple ribbons. Um, Embedded with marble pillars, gold and silver couches stood on the mosaic patterns. And then it talks about a bunch of different stones, marble and mother of pearl and other costly stones. And then flipping to the very end where they mention these same colors again, it's in Esther chapter 8. And this is when Mordecai, he left the king's presence wearing the royal robe of blue and white and the great crown of gold and an outer cloak of fine linen and purple. And so it's just kind of interesting because we know that these are also the colors of the high priest, the robes of the high priest, and the threads, which Jessica so beautifully talked about. Um, and it's kind of like before, what he was wearing didn't really fit. He was dressed as a royal official, but then he put on the sackcloth and now he's fitting into the palace, like he fits with these colors, like he matches. And so it's just kind of interesting. I really liked the symbolism there, looking at all of those colors and then contrasting it with the Whore of Babylon and the end times, how there's just that one little color change and you can tell it's the opposite. And Jessica and I were kind of talking over text a little bit today, and we were talking about those threads and how the colors of blue and red and purple kind of, we can see them in our body, in our veins. Like, if you say somebody's blue blooded or whatever, like you can kind of see like the veins, at least in my skin, they look like kind of bluish, but we know that blood itself is red. And so if you kind of think of the threads throughout our body, we've got the blood that pumps from the heart. That's a very oxygen rich, full of red. But then when it comes back, it's blue. And I guess that's kind of, it also has that same structure in my mind, that like kind of why I wanted to bring this out, because it's that same kind of thing. Like we see this symbolism even in our bodies. It comes out sinful, but it goes back ready to be nourished again. And I don't know, just I thought that was cool, like looking at all those colors and the symbols of them. did you have anything you wanted to say about the colors before we move
Well,
on?
I want to just add like a couple thoughts on how they
Mhm.
dye these fabrics. So the purple, it's difficult to dye. The way that they would get the red has a really beautiful tie into the Savior because when you and I did study this for the Scarlet Thread paper that I'm writing, so
Mhm.
I'm going to be pulling from that. But basically, there's this word. It's the word tolah or toloth, and it's basically this little grub, like a little magnet, and
Mhm.
it's a crimson grub, and they would get the color for the scarlet dye from this crimson grub. So the this little worm or insect, it would basically be mushed up
Mhm.
into a
Yeah.
dye. Okay, so it dies and then it brings the dye. And so there's like a really interesting little savior idea there. So like the
Mhm.
color of lifeblood becomes this vivid scarlet thread through this like sacrifice, right? This sacrificial system. And so that's kind of the interesting thing there. And then with the blue, it's kind of similar. So the blue thread, it they would use it for the zeet, the little blue fringe on the zeet. And I talked about this before in past Come Follow Me episodes, but basically, the way that they would get the blue is kind of similar. It was from another animal or a little. Let me see. I was trying to find it, but it's the tekelet or
Mhm.
tekelet
Techelet.
Techelet, but it symbolized heavenly glory, okay? And so that's where you're getting the idea of heaven with blue. And if you think of the sky
Mhm.
being blue, there's just all kinds of ideas of heaven there just with the blue sky. And so both of these things are coming through some kind of like a life that is sacrificed to make the dye. So it's just kind of interesting. And when you mix those together, you get purple.
Well, and there was a guy that was trying to recreate the Techelet blue for the some of the temple rituals or something in Israel 360. I think it was Jared's channel that talked about this, but that he actually was able to take cow's blood and be able to make what he thought was eventually like close to what he thought the Techelet blue would be. And so it's
Oh, cool.
interesting that blood can produce blue dye.
Yeah.
Like, and that was
Or
totally a
red.
symbol of Christ. Yeah, it was beautiful. And if you like, there's certain ways that you can work with any kind of blood. The chemicals in it actually can create lots of different blue dyes. So that's kind of interesting there.
Yeah, and all of these are used in the veil of the temple. So remember back in Exodus, it's like 35:35. I've used that verse a lot, and it uses all of these colors, all of these same materials are in God's temple, in Solomon's temple,
And
and
the
in the
robes of the high
tabernacle,
priest. Mhm.
and the robes of
All
the
of
high
yep.
priest. And so what's interesting is that these worldly kings are using it. This is a signal of the kings and the Persian Empire's wealth.
Mhm.
And it's also symbols of God and his wealth.
Well, and
So
you have
it's
this thing with
interesting.
the gemstones here too, because it talks about the palace materials. There's the marble and there's the precious stones and all of that. And we know that there are 12 specific stones that are also mentioned in the book of Revelation, if you want to do a side study on that, that are also found in the vesture of the high priest, the
Right.
breastplate. And so it's really kind of cool thinking of that. Um, if we can move on to the
Oh,
next one,
that's
unless there's
cool,
something else that
Thomas.
anybody else
I'm
wants
going to
to
look that
say
up.
about colors and
I'm going to look up the videos that Thomas is talking about. I love like the dyeing and like how they do all that stuff. And so that
oh
thing,
yeah,
whatever
uh-huh.
you said from
Yeah.
Jared from Christian Homestead, you're talking about him, right? He like
Yeah, yeah,
featured
yeah.
on his channel too.
I think
Yeah,
that's where I heard it. Yeah, I don't
probably because he
wanna
does
quote
a
me on
lot
it.
of that stuff like from the Israel 365.
It's
Um,
cool.
Yeah, so the next slide we have is our numbers in the book of
Mhm.
Esther, and Rachel went through and was like highlighting all the numbers. And so basically, we were noticing how the author just they're assigning meaning to the numbers. They follow both the biblical number pattern, but then within the context of the literary structure, you gain some additional insights on the numbers and how they're being used. So, do you
Yeah,
want to take it away on that?
so you remember how she had to be prepared for 12 months. But there's also like a section in the 12 months that's 6 months of this type of preparation and 6 months of this type of preparation. Is the ointments and the perfumes and all of that. And so like I kind of did some digging, though I didn't really do like a ton of digging on like how they would go and prepare these things. But it's basically like they made them take baths that softened the skin. And I thought about that, and I was like, we have kind of like, if she's just a normal, Jewish girl or whatever, she'd probably have rougher skin. And so, like, them getting the collagen from the plants or whatever else is needed to be able to go through those, those rituals. I think I had somewhere on here.
They basically get a year of pampering and like
Yeah.
spa treatment.
But it's interesting because it's like there's the 2 sets in the year, in that 12. And then there's also the 2 banquets. And I was kind of thinking on the symbolism that why did she not reveal everything the first banquet? And then I got thinking about, I was like, well, Christ, when he came, he revealed many things in part, but he didn't reveal everything. And that's eventually, I mean, the church that was created, that he couldn't reveal more at that time. The church that was created at the time eventually fell away into apostasy. And so the second day, the second banquet, is when it was all revealed, and Satan was revealed. And that's one of the things we read about in Doctrine and Covenants, that the man of sin would be revealed. And there was I would have to go back and pull out these things. I don't know exactly the reference, but once again, Jared from Christian Homestead mentioned this specifically. If there was an instance where they had recorded in church history of when Satan was revealed. Um, and so that was kind of referencing once again those
Yeah,
last
it's in the
days.
Joseph Smith papers. And I
Yeah,
remember
yeah,
when he
that's
did,
what it is.
yeah, it's like a famous story. And
Interesting.
he went back to the source on that one. So another thing, you were
Yeah,
talking about the 6 months and the 12 months too. That's interesting too, because if you think about it, Esther has two identities, right? She has Hadassah and Esther. And so
yeah,
there's that reversal and then the revelation of who she truly is. So that's kind of interesting.
yeah.
So a lot of these, there's like biblical symbolism tied to them. The number 3 obviously is tied to the Godhead. The number 7 is obviously tied to like wholeness or complete. 12 is always tied to priesthood, and 10 is always tied to a period of like judgment or trial. 13, it in this story, it was the day of threat. It was the 13th day of Adar. That was the day that the Jewish people were to be destroyed, but that ends up becoming the day of their deliverance. So it represents like a reversal. And then you've also got the 127 was the provinces,
Hmm.
and
Which is
the
interesting because that one specifically, like that number is really cool when you get into the meat of it. Um, shoot, let me see if I can find go up here on my notes. um, the 127. Oh shoot, I guess I had not written that down, but yeah, it's just kind of talking about the universality and the totalness of it. You've got 7, which means completion or perfection. You've got the 100 in there, and you've also got the 20, and 120 have specific meaning. And so when you have 127, like there's definitely a reference to God's dominance over all of this. Yeah.
yeah,
Would
and
that
that's
be
interesting.
his sovereignty,
Hmm.
his providence and sovereignty? Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, perhaps. Well, if I pull up the verse where that one was in, I was trying to, let's see. So that was verse 2. No, Esther verse
I
1
think it's
1.
the first verse, yeah,
Yeah, the
of the
very, very
story.
first verse in the story. Um, that it kind of mentions that, and it's like, well, okay, well, this is definitely referencing something greater than this earth. This is talking about the heavenly king. This is talking about the God of heaven and earth. Like there's definitely like a symbolism there with God. Like I feel like the characters in this story are representing Christ in 4 different facets in a way. How Haman, like even Haman, I know that he's like the bad guy of the story, but even he takes the place of Mordecai, and so there's also a Christology there happening, even with that little detail. But there's another number that I find very very beautiful in this whole thing, and it's in Esther chapter 9. um, this one just kind of blew me away. This is the one that got me teary-eyed when I was reading this story. So if we go to Esther chapter 9, and this is in verse 16, He said, "Meanwhile, the other Jews throughout the king's provinces had gathered together to defend their lives." And we know that that's kind of like there's this end time, like think end times, and how like Gog and Magog, and like there's this, trying to defeat evil.
Right.
They gained relief from all their enemies, killing 75,000 of those that hated them, but they did not take any plunder. So I looked up what it meant for this 75,000, and it means total deliverance, divine justice. And I
That's
was just
beautiful.
like divine grace, like it has connotations of grace. And it's just like, we know that when all of this is said and done, when we finally get to the end of the end chapters, that God's grace will be applied in multiplicity. So I
So can
really
I
love
add
that
one
Well,
one.
thing on the one
I
two?
look
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
yeah, I looked up what the 120. So when you look at this, um, the number 100 is completeness. 20 means
Mhm.
testing or waiting, and 7 means divine perfection.
You see the chiasmus
So
even in the number.
so
Cool.
127 empire wide scope means that there is a complete testing or waiting period towards divine perfection.
Yeah, and I was actually going to say that, but the way I was going to do it was dividing it up. If you look at 1 and then 2 and then 7 separately, that is what it
Well,
comes to. Because and so I have this old, it's like an old handout that I got. It was actually my daughter. She sent it to me, but she got it in her seminary class, and it goes through all the biblical numbers. And when you break them up like that, here's another thing that's interesting is 2 equals 1 equals God, right? Because God is not a single bachelor in heaven, according to our theology and our understanding. He is a father who is with a wife, a mother, right? And so we have this idea that there's 2 that make one complete unit. So 1 becomes 2 to make wholeness or the completeness. And so anyway, that's another idea that kind of goes that direction with 127. And I think in this story, when you look at the literary structure and you look at what's happening there in chapter 9 compared to what's happening in chapter 1, the idea that you're getting is totality, right? Because you're
Right.
getting that it goes to all the provinces. This decree, it covers all parts of this empire. And so again, you get that idea of universality and like the reach being to the ends of the kingdom. Well, if you're talking about the heavenly kingdom, yes, it's eternal, it's everywhere, it's forever.
and
And so
and
that's
the
kind of
the
interesting.
gematria of all of this is just so fascinating. Which Thomas, is that right? I'm saying that right, but yeah, it's it's really cool. All of this really cool. Um,
Yeah,
I
Google it. What
yeah,
is the gematria meaning?
yeah. And then there's also like you were
Because that's
mentioning,
where you have to do the like 1 plus 2 plus 7,
yeah,
which brings you to 10.
because
Hold on.
in ours it's
I have
one
it in a
one and
file
two
on
is
my phone. I'll
three.
look it up.
Three is the number of God, and then seven is the number of perfection. So it's like God
Right.
in perfection. So yeah.
Yeah, because I have a file that I got, and it actually comes from Richard Draper when I was studying the book of Revelation, where he went through all of his gematria, his gematria
Mhm.
slides, and I took all the notes down, and I was like, oh, I got to get this. And I do have like a thing where it's basically like you break down the number and you got to bring it back to, I think it's like the single number, which actually should go back to 1.
Yeah.
Right.
Because and so then if you look at the number 1 on hold
Because
on, number
sometimes the number
1.
1 is not the loneliest number.
Yeah, it's
Okay, you didn't get
anyway,
that
I'll have to
reference.
look that one up later, but I have like a file where I have all those notes from that. Anyway, the point is pay attention to the numbers, guys, because there's some really
Right.
interesting things going on there. And when you look at it through the lens of the literary structure, then you can kind of come away with an interpretation. The literary structure is going to help provide the context for how to interpret the symbol
And here's where it comes in the Latter Day Bride. Can I actually have you go back once really quick to that slide?
to the
Because
numbers.
yeah, this is Esther chapter 2 verse 16. It says that Esther was taken to King Xerxes at the royal palace in early winter of the 7th year of
Hmm.
his reign. Who was born in the winter? like Joseph Smith. And so like
Mhm.
thinking about Esther as the latter-day bride, I really think that there is some interestingness there. But you can also think of like we're in, like, I don't know, there's some debate about which seal we're in, but we're in the
Right.
7,000th year or very, very close to it. And so we have the early winter of the seventh year. I feel like that's kind of the pinnacle moment, like where we're at right now, in our like world history. We're like at that point, and so Esther, it's Esther that is taken to
So
to
to
finally like,
to
get this end times.
support what you're saying with Esther, so there was a period of waiting, right? So there was the 30 days. This was a season of waiting. And what's interesting about that is if you look at Doctrine and Covenants, and I think it was Gerald Lund in his book Second Coming of the Lord, he pointed this out, and I have like a whole quote that I could try to find, but for the sake of time I won't. I'll try to paraphrase it. But essentially what he said
Right.
was how he just called out in the Doctrine and Covenants. He's looking at the book of Revelation and like the framework that we get in the Doctrine and Covenants where Joseph's asking all the questions. I think it's section 77 of the Doctrine and Covenants. And he asks what the seals mean. And this is where we get the definition. And they're highly symbolic. Okay. They're highly, highly symbolic. And then you go when he asks about there's a time that's captured there. It's from the opening of the seventh seal to the second coming. There's no time frame given. Like there's no
Yeah,
way to judge how long that takes. But
yeah,
symbolically, what it represents in the book of Revelation is a period of waiting on the Lord. It's just like what's happening in the story of Esther.
yeah. And so just yeah, it's really interesting to see that. And then it's like sorry, I lost what I was looking at here, but yeah, all of these numbers just really have a lot of cool things that you can pull from it. Even the height of the pole, 75 feet tall. Um,
Mhm.
so yeah, just going off of that, we can move on to the next thing unless there's anything else with numbers we wanted to highlight. But
Nope.
I
But
think
we
those
are
were the
getting up
main
to 3
ones.
hours, just so
yeah,
Yeah,
you
we
know.
are getting close. We probably ought to move on.
we have like basically this, and then we're done. So there's like three
Okay.
slides left here, and so let's just
Sorry.
try to we'll try to move through them because we have some really cool royal objects that are
Yeah,
happening here, and there's a lot of symbolism going on with these. So like you see throughout Esther, there's authority that's being exercised through these symbolic royal objects. And so I kind of did like a little breakdown, and this was just based on Rachel's notes and what we were talking about earlier. And so the breakdown is right here in this slide. Hopefully that encompasses everything, but you have the crown where that's listed. The scripture references are right there, but you get from the context kingship, honor, and royal office. In Esther's case, queenship. And then you have the ring or the signet, and that's another one that was used a lot. And I don't know, did we even put, yeah, the ring signets on there? And then that one, it represented the delegated authority. So remember how he keeps giving his ring as a signet to seal these decrees that are irreversible and of like irrevocable legal force. And so that's kind of what the ring is representing, is that authority and that
and
power.
also the covenant. Because it's a circle. There's the ring is
Well,
a
and think
circle,
of
and
the
so there's that
seal.
covenant. Yeah, the
See, look
seal on
over
it.
here on
It's
the little
sealed.
decree. Do you see that little
Yeah.
red seal?
Mhm. Yeah.
That is the symbol in John's dream. So when you're looking at the seven seals, that is
Yeah.
what it represents.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah,
is that
exactly.
seal, that signet. And remember, there's only one who can open the seals. All the seals have to be opened before the scroll can be read. There's seven seals
Mhm.
on it. So anyway, that's just another kind of spiritual symbol. And then you've got this golden scepter, which is very interesting because this one often gets tied to Lehi's dream of the tree of life and the iron rod being the word of God and representing the scepter that's being extended from the tree, which is like the throne where Jesus sits. And so there's this idea in this context of Esther where the scepter is connected to mercy and access to the king and the preservation of life, because as he extends the scepter to her, she gets access to him and she has her life given to her. And
It's
so,
also a symbol of authority too. And if you think about Joseph Smith's first vision here, like kind of as like the symbolism, he was the one reaching out to the king. I mean, he could have died in the presence of the Lord, just the same as Esther could have died in the presence of the king. But she touched that scepter, and suddenly the authority for her to be able to speak to the king was there. So I think that's really cool how it connects to that one.
Mhm.
There's one more symbol on here that I really think is cool to talk about, unless there was anything else you wanted to say about the scepter. No?
Oh,
Okay.
no,
Go
go
ahead.
for it.
Is the
Well,
horses. Okay. Oh, did you have a question?
well, if you go to Revelation, I'm trying to find out which Revelation it is, but if you go to Revelation, it's either in Revelation 2 or Revelation 3, where we receive the scepter of righteousness. Let me
Yes, your scepter of unfailing truth and righteousness, I think is the quote you're thinking of. Yeah, it's really cool.
Well, it grants life, and that's the
Uh,
idea. So when he extends the scepter, it grants life, and that's what we get. But it's in this case, it's eternal life when you're talking about the eternal king.
yeah.
right.
So with the horses, if we're ready to move on to that, yes, we're good.
You go with
Okay,
whatever
okay,
symbol
okay.
you want to talk
All
about.
right. So the horses, with the horses, we think about what was it that Jesus came into Jerusalem riding on?
A
It was a
donkey.
donkey or a horse. You know, you can kind of think of it in the same way. And one of the things that was talked about with Haman is that he would ride on the king's horse, who was also brought into the inn from like the Samaritan that was there. He was brought on his own beast, right? And so there's kind of like a symbolism there with horses and how he would ride on that body in the presence of the king. But then there's also this part in chapter, oh, I hope I didn't lose it. Oh, where okay, so this is in Esther chapter 3. He says the decree of was written in the name of King Xerxes and sealed with the king's signet ring, which we talked about, has that covenant connection, and of course the authority. And then it says dispatchers were sent out by swift messengers to all the provinces. And so that sense of it being from the king or of the king, I think is really cool. Because the same thing happens again at the end of the book with the horses, in that they make a proclamation. And once again, oh, if I can find it here, let's see. Shoot, I should have organized everything. Oh, gosh, it's been such a busy couple of days. Um,
I'll say one thing about horses while you're on that.
yeah,
So
go
in
ahead.
this
Sorry, I'm trying to
in the
find it here.
context in Esther, they are being used as messenger horses and then
Mhm.
also as royalty, like a symbol of royalty. So like when Haman wants to ride on the king's horse and it ends up being Mordecai, there's a symbol there that's happening. And so horses can mean a lot of things. They can mean military power. They can
Mhm.
definitely be tied to a king. In the book of Revelation, they're tied to Jesus Christ, who comes on the white horse wearing the red robe and the crown. And that's what happens at the end of the book of Revelation when the second coming in glory happens. And so there's all kinds of horse symbols, but when you put it in this context, in this framework, which the structure is giving us, we're seeing that what's happening is horses, mules, camels, all of these things symbolize a couple of things that pertain to royal messengers, the decrees going out through the power of the kingdom. Okay, so this is kind of like another royal object and signifying the power of this kingdom and the wealth of it, that they can send these messengers out and get these decrees out to all 127 provinces very quickly with speed. And all the people who are coming in on camels and things coming to the kingdom, they're coming to meet with the king. And so think about it in that context, because you can link it to anything, right? Like you could link a camel to a ton of different other things, and that all fits too. You can use the camel like the eye through a needle, the camel thing, whatever. You know what I'm talking about. You know what I'm talking about, Tim. The one about like it's easier to get the rich man
It's
through,
easier
like,
for it is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than a
yes,
rich man to get to the kingdom of heaven.
yes, that one. The camel through the eye of the needle. Okay, so there's all these like different symbols that are happening in here, and I think that one
That's
thing
where
that
it
I
is. I
really
found
like
it.
is when you put it in its own context first, and you see how it's being used in that context, and then from there you expand out, and then you can start connecting all the imagery.
I found where it is in the next half of the book. Sorry, it took me forever to find it, but it's in Esther chapter 8, and just using the New Living Translation. I'm just gonna
Yeah, I think
click
it's
on that
8.
really
Is it
quick.
10 through 14?
Yeah, because there was a way that it was worded here that was just very so a decree was written in the name of Xerxes and sealed with the king's signet, and Mordecai sent the dispatches by swift messengers who rode on fast horses. You were kind of mentioning that, but I guess when I thought of that, when I said a decree was written, I was thinking, man, that kind of sounds like proclamation to the family. That kind of sounds like the restoration, like proclamation, like I guess that's kind of what came to mind when I was like thinking of this in terms of the Latter Day Bride, is I was like, we've sent out missionaries, and we've sent out not only missionaries on fast horses, we've sent this out like with proclamations and with the decrees, like, from the king
Well, the
himself. So
written
I thought
decrees,
that was really
the
cool.
written decrees establish the binding law, and
Mm-hmm.
that are signified by the king. And so they determine life or death too in this story. And so if you think about the written decrees that are going forth from the heavenly king, yes,
Mm-hmm.
it's going to the idea of totality, universality, which is what that
Yeah.
127 was representing. It's going with speed, and it's going to determine the binding law that leads to life or death. And so this is a covenant with life or death, and that's what's happening here. Haman made the covenant with death, and Esther and
And
Mordecai make the covenant with life.
it has the copies of the decree going out issued to every province. Yeah. So it's really cool.
Which means everyone, it's kind of like the all nations will receive, right? The word
Mm-hmm.
of the Lord, that like every kindred, nation, tongue, and people. It's that idea. It's the four corners of the earth. So all of that is kind of what I think it's trying to signify there.
You know what
And
this reminds me of?
hmm,
Uh, when King Benjamin is giving a speech and the people were gathered, and he had to dispatch people writing down what he said and sent them out to those
that's a
who
good
were
one.
not those who were beyond his beyond hearing what he was actually teaching and saying. And so he would dispatch these couriers, what we would understand as couriers today,
Kind of like
so
the
that they
ensign
could
bringing the message from the
the Leahona, bringing the message to the people. Yeah.
And look at verse 9 also in that same verse. That was the one. This is the one I was actually really wanting to find, and I couldn't find it. I just found it. It says the decree was written in the scripts and languages of all the people of the empire, including that of the Jews.
every
So it's
nation,
like how
kindred,
the
tongue, and
Book of
people.
Mormon has it written. So yeah, there's definitely a Latter Day parallel here. I love it.
Yeah,
Well,
I like that. That's cool.
it's almost like this is an Old Testament version of the day of Pentecost, when people are praying and prophesying, and the Spirit descends as if fiery tongues are upon them, and people are hearing them in their own native tongues.
Yeah,
So I had
and at
made a note
Pentecost.
on the animals thing, and I don't know if you guys want me to share this, but it kind of makes a broader connection. So basically, think about all the times that the animals are used, and in this context, it's representing the king's power. And definitely like a bride bridegroom motif is happening, a king and kingdom motif. But if you look at animals in other places in the scriptures where there's like messenger animals happening, because that's what's happening here, then you can kind of link it to like all the times where a messenger animals being done. So like think about Elijah. We talked about the ravens feeding him in the
Hmm.
wilderness. Remember
Balaam
Balaam
the
the donkey
donkey.
who spoke and
Yeah.
he rebuked that prophet. And then there's Jonah's the fish that preserved the Lord's servant. There's the dove that announces the new creation after Noah and the ark. And there's the white horse in the book of Revelation, which I think is ultimately kind of what those horses are pointing to, that victorious advance
Mhm.
that the Savior
That's
makes.
so cool.
And so all of that I think you can pull in, because when you understand the context in which the horses are being used, then you can look elsewhere for that same context and get the same theme and the same message. And so
Mhm.
there may be like a theological pattern happening there too, because God frequently governs his kingdom through delegated authority. And in this case, he's incorporating the animals as part of that, which is kind of neat. But he entrusts his covenant, his priesthood authority, like the way that we administer the ordinances, the written revelations, all of those things through our our prophets and through his messengers and his servants and all of those who are commissioned to do a work for him and to join in that work. And in this case, we're seeing the animals joining in that too throughout the scriptures, which is kind of neat to think about. That it's like, even like when you look at kind of the symbolism of like, I don't know, the lilies of the field, how they grow, right? And like the birds and how God clothes the grass of the fields and feeds the birds. And it's like he's mindful of all of creation, and all of creation is participating in the work. And so I just kind of like that idea.
Yeah.
Okay, so here's our last one of symbolism. There's a huge bride-bridegroom motif going on. And one of the things that I had researched before this was just, it's kind of more of an evangelical view. They talk about this a lot in the evangelical blogosphere. You'll find tons and tons of articles about Esther and the bride and the bridegroom motif that's happening because it's so strong in this story. And so I think for me, it's one of the richer symbols in Esther, and I completely concur with mainstream Christianity on the fact that there is a bride-bridegroom motif happening here.
Mhm.
And I think while many evangelical commentators identify the king Ahasuerus directly with Christ and Esther with the church, I think the symbolism might be even richer for us if we read it through the lens of Isaiah and the restoration scriptures that we have, like in the Doctrine and Covenants. Particularly, there are tons of bride and bridegroom references, starting with section 1 of the Doctrine and Covenants, where the Lord is telling us to prepare for the bridegroom who's coming for his bride. And so I think Isaiah, he repeatedly portrays Zion as the bride, like daughter Zion or the woman Zion, preparing for her covenant union with the Lord. And Isaiah, he declares in Isaiah 54:5, thy maker is thine husband. And he later promises in Isaiah 62:5, as the bridegroom rejoiceth over the bride, so shall thy God rejoice over thee. And the relationship is covenantal. We see that through all of these things that we just showed. And also in the book of Isaiah, he'll show that too. So it's about the bride and bridegroom motif is about becoming God's covenant people, becoming his bride, and bringing forth his children. And so there's like a whole marriage thing going on there. Well, the Doctrine and Covenants, it develops the imagery quite a bit. The Lord, like even in section 33, there's a part where it's saying, prepare ye for that which is to come, for the Lord is nigh. Section 65 speaks of it. The marriage of the Lamb has come, it says. Section 133 calls the saints to gather and sanctify themselves to prepare to meet the bridegroom. So there's lots of this in the restoration. And so I think that motif, even though it tends to be like an evangelical way of talking about the scriptures, it definitely applies in our modern restoration.
And I feel like it not only applies, but it actually proves the truth of the restoration. Because you have, like, if you look at the deeper symbols and not just the overview of the symbols, I feel like the evangelicals, they get it right, and even Catholics, well, they'll use this same thing. They'll get it right up to this point, and they'll have a sense of where, yes, you can see that because you've got Moses, the first bride, and then you've got Christ's era, the second bride. But then we have this extra, like awesome symbolism that it happens again. There's two banquets. There's two. So we have the same thing with Christ and the early church, and then the Latter-day Church. So we have that bride motif that happens again. It's really cool seeing it.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that I made some notes about on this whole bridegroom thing is just how Esther, it really illustrates the pattern here, the covenant pattern that's associated with this bride and bridegroom motif. So she begins as an orphan, and we talked about that as being an interesting idea because she's without status, power, or inheritance, right? And that's the thing that has to do with the Abrahamic covenant, is that you're getting back the inheritance and the authority and all of those things, but through covenant with Christ. And we have those same covenants and ordinances being administered through authorized servants who have that authority. So think about that signet ring and all of those symbols that we just talked about of the royal symbolism. Like here we have the scepter of grace being mentioned again as part of the bridegroom motif and what the king represents there. And we also have a guide, Mordecai, and look at how he counsels Esther. And he's the one who helps her see her divine purpose and position. And he kind of represents those who are called to intercede and he's like a father figure to her. He's the
Right.
adopted father. Okay. And the
Which
church,
is
I see it
also
as a foster
important
father
when
and nursing
thinking
mother.
right. And that's another thing that we get that extra layer of in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. We understand that adoptive father motif even stronger, I feel
Right.
like.
We do. And
Well,
Isaiah 49, 22 to 23 really hits that one home with the foster fathers
Right.
and nursing mothers, the kings and
Yeah.
queens of the Gentiles who nurse and mother and father the house of Israel, the children
Mhm.
of Israel.
well, I was going to say there, and I don't know if this is just something that I'm connecting with, or if you guys are seeing this as well. But what came to mind is I see a connection with Esther to the prodigal son. The Esther is a type of a prodigal daughter, but she didn't go off into a far country and dispose of all her inheritance. But in a sense, she is a prodigal daughter because she has
It's
no
Eve.
inheritance.
Yeah. It's
Huh?
Eve in a way. It's like Eve in a way. Yeah.
You
There's
see it
I
more
mean,
connecting with
yeah.
Eve.
I think like the way I would say it, if you're connecting it to the prodigal, would be because she doesn't sin. She remains faithful
No,
to the
no.
Lord. However, one thing that you could note in this, and other scholars have pointed this out, and this may be another reason why this is not in the Dead Sea Scrolls, this story, but it's because you're talking about a Hebrew bride who doesn't appear to be practicing the law of Moses. There's no indication in here that she is practicing her religion like outwardly. She clearly is inwardly. But outwardly it doesn't appear that she is. And then the other thing, and I read this in that paper where it was talking about the Qumran scrolls and why it's not there. But one of the other theories was that it's because it's showing a Hebrew bride marrying a foreign king. And this is kind of like taboo in that Qumran community. And so I think there's a lot of what I would call unorthodox things happening in this story. But where it hits the latter day restoration is in this idea of the coming together of people who have their identity hidden. It's that Joseph in Egypt, where his identity as one of God's people, covenant people, is hidden. The same thing's happening with Esther. And where I see the restoration connection is in the fact that she's joining with a Gentile kingdom. And through that, the deliverance comes to the people who've covenanted with Jehovah, and then more
Mhm.
people join in that covenant as a result of what happens.
Right.
And I do think that
Yeah.
when you look at the Doctrine and Covenants, there's a lot of that going on in the Doctrine and Covenants, like right here with this story of Esther. So before entering the king's presence, she undergoes that year of preparation that Rachel is talking about, and it's a purification ritual is what she's going through. And so if you view it literally as part of the Persian court custom or symbolically, the emphasis is the same. There's this entrance into the royal presence that requires preparation. And this is the preparation that the bride is undergoing. And if you look at the progress that happens in Doctrine and Covenants, like remember last year when we were studying the Come Follow Me on Doctrine and Covenants in church history, there is so much of this, these themes of
Right.
like preparation and this bride being prepared and adorned,
Well,
right? Because
when
that's
you
what
look
it
at
leads to.
the Jewish customs, especially when it comes to the first century, the betrothal covenant or contract, depending on how you want to look at it, the betrothal covenant is made with the father. There is a decree that is written and is sealed, and they drink new wine to celebrate that. Then the bride to be prepares herself for the coming of the bridegroom, because the bridegroom is going to prepare a place to bring his bride into. And this mirrors the plan of salvation. Christ, through the Father, decreed the atonement, the salvation, and then he tells his disciples, I go and prepare a place for you. And so we are in a spiritual preparation for the coming bridegroom, who's Jesus Christ. So we are to prepare our hearts, our minds. We are to walk in humility. We are to walk in faith. We are to walk in covenantal relationship with who God is, who Christ is, and walk in covenantal fidelity with one another, because ultimately Christ is going to return to take his bride back home into the kingdom. And so we see this idea. What I see here is that when she finally comes into the king's court and the golden scepter is pointed right at her, that's basically a type and shadow, I think, for the celestial kingdom.
So
Can
I
I
did a whole video series on this bridegroom motif, and I have a slide actually in a different slideshow from that, where I listed out all of the parts of the process that was recorded anciently. And this is what one scholar put together based on both ancient Jewish and ancient Christian practices. So it goes back to Old Testament times and New Testament times and post New Testament times, and they try to put it all together. And they trace kind of like the progress of the preparation of the bride and what this whole wedding um, symbolism means. And it's actually very unclear. Like, it's pretty spotty, but a lot of the customs and traditions that we have, including things like, I don't know, like in the Irish tradition, how they do the hand clasp and the wrapping of the ties, that goes back to like some older Hebrew traditions. And so there's all of these different traditions that they log. And there was this really wonderful book. It's called it's the one by Donna B. Nielsen. That if you guys want to understand this motif, you got to read that book, because she did so much research on it. And it's called Beloved Bridegroom. And I think nobody's researched it more than her, from what I can tell, especially
it
from a
is a good
Latter-day
book.
Saint perspective.
I've read it, and there's some really cool things in there. Yeah.
But I think in here, so like, first of all, I just want to point something out. The reason why people are looking at this king as like as the bridegroom, I think, is just because he's the king and they're viewing Esther as the bride. Now, this king is not a righteous king, and he's like doing
No,
all
he's
kinds of
not.
missteps along the way. But I think the reason
Yeah.
why they're looking at it
Don't
this
take it too
way,
literally.
yeah, you can't. You can't. But the reason why is because what we're seeing in this story is a temporal salvation that comes
Mhm.
through this
Right.
this joining with a king who has delegated authority, and he's acting in his capacity. And so there are some parallels you can draw to Christ. Now, Esther also is, I think she's the type of Christ actually in this. I know that Christians tend to look at her as the bride, but I actually think that the way we tend to view her, like when we teach these lessons in the LDS church, is we are looking at her as a type of Christ. And so, like Don Perry,
Right.
he has written a ton of books, and one of them he did was Finding Christ in the Old Testament. And for Esther, he links her as part of the type of Christ. So it's really beautiful. You can look that up. I think they even have that on Scripture Central, where you can just download that whole book that he wrote. And I refer
Right.
to a lot this year as I'm teaching. And so that's another thing that you can do is it's not really that the king is good, but he kind of fits a pattern. And so I think the way that you would need to look at this through that kind of evangelical lens is that Esther represents the bride in a certain way, where she's receiving counsel from Mordecai. He's kind of representing like a father role. You could think of it as like the Holy Spirit or the prophet too. There's a lot of ways you could look at him. But my method is to like put myself in each person's shoes and then try to
Right.
think about what that means for me. Like, for example, the Lord has given me a stewardship of my own, and I can try to relate to both the king and to Esther, to Mordecai, definitely to Haman, because I've had my moments. But it's like we all have like a way in which we can relate to each character, and I think it's
True.
good to try to put yourself in all of the characters' shoes just to see what
Right.
you can learn
Can I
from it.
point out one more thing about this Latter-day Bride thing, unless you had something more you wanted to say? It's okay. So one thing that I thought was interesting is that Mordecai is of the tribe of Benjamin. And do you remember how I told you a couple of weeks ago, we talked
Same
about
as King
how
Saul.
all of the names of the 12 tribes of Israel have a specific meaning?
Yeah.
And Joseph, his name means he will add. So literally in scripture, it's talking about how he's telling us that there will be some addition to what has already been given. And then also Benjamin is the one right after that. Benjamin means son of the right hand. And so if Mordecai is of that family line, it's a very interesting symbol. But then you also think, well, we just studied about a king who was also of the line of Benjamin. The first king of Israel was Saul. And so you've got this parallel here of two people that came from Saul, one that became a king from rags to riches, and then another one who became not a king, but second hand to the king, because that's another thing it mentions in Esther. Just like Joseph of Egypt, he becomes the second hand to the king. At the last few scriptures, it talks about that. And so we see this rags to riches from the king, from the tribes of Benjamin, but we've got what happened on the one hand and what happened on the other, with the righteousness and the glory added, whereas Saul fell. So there's just some really cool parallels with the tribe of Benjamin there too.
Yeah, that is really interesting. I like that.
And,
And I
and
do
that
think,
Benjamin's the last son too. And so if we think of those dispensational patterns, 12 dispensational patterns, the 6 here and the 6 here, we've also got that duality of the year, like thinking
yeah,
of it
that's a
with
good
the
one.
Esther thing. So there's it connects so many different ways. But Benjamin is the last son. He's the last one. So this is clearly pointing at this is what's going to happen in the last times. And if you are paying attention and have ears to hear and eyes to see, you will see the patterns and you will know this is what to expect.
Yeah. That's really cool. I like that, Rachel. Yeah, I think that you can definitely do a deep dive on all of these names, and it does mention him being part of the tribe of Benjamin. I think that there is definitely a path you could go on down there, but ultimately it would probably go back to that original son of Israel, Benjamin. And remember, he was also this was from the Joseph in Egypt thing, but we did a whole thing about Joseph's name and being added upon, then his sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, what their names mean. We went through all 12 of the sons of Israel. Rachel had put together some infographics. So if you guys want more on that, go find the one that we did on Genesis. It was chapters 37 through 50, where we did the Joseph in Egypt story. And there was a little bit of an hourglass, kind of like a chiastic structure happening there. It wasn't a true technical chiasm, but it was more of an hourglass with the center point being Joseph revealing his hidden identity. And so there's kind of a parallel there with Esther. Okay, so kind of our final thoughts here. I wanted to link this to the idea of divine orbits because one of the I can't remember if it was in the scripture study helps or if it was in the lesson itself, but it linked to this old talk by Neil A. Maxwell. I happen to really love Neil A. Maxwell. He's just one of my favorite speakers because he's so poetic, and he has this really great quote from it was one of the talks called I think it was the Endure. I can't remember the name of it, but I don't even think I put it in this note here, but I have it in my notes. But he said, brothers and sisters, by divine appointment, these are our days. Recall the new star that announced the birth at Bethlehem. It was in its precise orbit long before it so shone. We are likewise placed in human orbits to illuminate. God is in the details. And I love this quote because I felt like it encapsulated the story of Esther, where the name Esther being associated traditionally with the Persian definition that links it to the star. And so traditionally we look at Esther as meaning star. And this idea of a divine orbit that I think is really beautiful is a star actually eventually burns out and goes away, but we don't. We're eternal. And I love that. I don't know, that the Lord, that this idea of divine orbits and placing us in a human orbit to illuminate is what he does. And so I don't know, I just liked that link to Esther and the idea of the star, because in this story we see God in the details, even though his name isn't mentioned in the story. And we see how each character in the story is playing a part in God's plan. No matter what they choose, the Lord's purposes will come about. And I just think that if we can find the ways in which we are placed in a human orbit and try to recognize God's hand in our life, that it may help us be able to find that communion with the Lord that Esther found through the fast, through this like focusing her energy on the Lord for guidance and direction in her life. Like, for example, we've all been given a patriarchal blessing, right? Like, we have that opportunity to receive a patriarchal blessing in the church. And think about all of the things that it can tell you about who you were premortally, the gifts that maybe God's given you, the path that he's placed you in, and the effects that you can have, and just all the different things that patriarchal blessings give you, as well as lineage and a connection to the house of Israel, and something for you to study and identify with in God's plan. And so I think one of the reasons that Esther is one of my favorite books, which is why I spent so much time on this one, is because it reminds me that I shouldn't underestimate my role in God's plan. Like, it doesn't feel like it matters very much, but from what I learned in the story of Esther is that it does matter. God is in the details. And so, a couple of food for thought questions, maybe for discussion, and I have 3. So let's put these all together. But has there ever been a season when you felt hidden or forgotten, only to realize later that God was quietly preparing you for something you couldn't see? And if Elder Maxwell's right, that each of us has been placed in human orbits to illuminate, what orbit has God placed you in right now? Your family, your calling, your workplace, your neighborhood? And what hidden work might God be doing in your life right now that you won't fully understand until much later? Remember that turning point and the center focus of that structure.
For
So,
me, I guess I think about the house fire that we had 2 years ago. Our house caught on fire, and uh, we were left. Like, it was the first time in my life I'd been left with like nothing except the clothes on my back. And it was a really eye-opening moment where I literally did feel like I had been forgotten and just tossed aside, or like you're not important, or even like that feeling of God's judgment is on you, and you're like, well, yeah, I'm not perfect, but I really didn't mean to be so imperfect. Like, all the thoughts that come to you. And I had an experience just a couple weeks ago where it was able to kind of come full circle, where a woman who had had her apartment burn, who probably felt pretty forgotten in that moment, and I know she did because she expressed it to me. I was able to then take what I had learned from that experience and share with her, you are not forgotten. God is not doing this to you because of some divine judgment. This is something that is happening to you, and He's going to help you through it. And it was just like these things just kind of like really, it was beautiful to be able to see, like, oh, yeah, I remember, like, looking back, how hard that lesson was for me to go through, and how difficult it was for me to trust that it wasn't my fault, or whatever. And just, I don't know, like, truly, like, those details often do come full circle in our lives, and every trial that we experience can be used in the future to help somebody else. And so the more that when we're in a trial moment, we can breathe and try to bring that peace to the Lord. And like I said earlier, it's like I was in the temple, and I was just building, like, pouring my worry out, and with that came a lot of fear and scaredness and all of that. And so if we can just take a breath and remember that when we're going through those trials, if we can just bring our peace to the Lord, bring our faith to the Lord, and bring all of that, that then He can grant us with that peace that we are seeking, and that we can, all of the bad things that we experience can eventually be redeemed in someone else's life, that they can be something that can be used to help another person in going through and getting through their hard times.
and for those of you who want to know more about Rachel's house fire experience, I actually interviewed her about this, and it's an episode that I posted a year ago. You can find it in the Latter Day Discussions podcast playlist on my channel, and it's episode number 2 called House Fire Miracle. So if you want to hear her story,
And it was
it was good.
miraculous. We had so many miracles. It was
It's got like a
beautiful.
burnt kind of charred book on it. It was the one that said "You Are
It
Loved,"
says
and
you are
it's on the
loved. Yeah, because
cover.
that was the exact thing. I was like, not. I was feeling like God didn't love me at this time in my life, and it was the first time in my life I'd ever felt this way. Like, just felt like I had been forgotten and that I wasn't loved. And literally, like God is like spelling it out for me, burning everything except for those words and the words, of course, that were written in the book. And the book, when I opened it, it was the coolest thing. It talked about it was page 26, 27, and talked about God touching the stones with his finger in the book of Ether, and the spark of light. I remember just reading the words, the spark of light can cause a flame that can consume the whole thing. And it was just like, oh my gosh, the light that we give off to other people truly can burn bright and fast if we let it, shine. And so it's just like I was like bawling when I read this because it was literally like miracle after miracle after miracle that the Lord let me know at that moment when I wasn't feeling it that he really did. He really did love me, even though I couldn't see it. So
Yeah, that's really beautiful, Rachel. I like that.
Yeah.
Well,
Well, I
final
think for me,
thoughts, Tim. What do you have? What's yours?
I, you know, I have to say, looking back on my life and all the struggles that I've been through, and I've said this earlier before, that when I was in the thick of my own struggles, and I'm thinking, I'm relying on my own self, I'm relying on my own willpower, I'm relying on my own strength, and I'm relying on my own resourcefulness merely just to survive from just moment to moment, day to day. You in the position I was in, it was probably the most trying position. All I knew was I needed to work and forced myself to stay awake because I literally had no place to rest, no place to sleep, and I was walking the streets of Seattle, and I'm going to the Daily Hall. I honestly cannot tell you how I was able to make it from day to day with little sleep, with little money, with just the only thing that I can keep me going is that I need to work and I need to find a way to just make it one day and every day. But now looking back, I can see those markers of God's grace quietly working in my life and quietly directing me and opening those doors that I needed to be open, giving me the strength that I needed to have the strength to just make it every single day. We're talking digging ditches and working in the cold, working in inclement weather, and just you know, sleep deprivation really does something to you that I would highly never recommend anybody to go through because you just you know but finally when I was able to get into a program and then start getting back on my one of the first things I had to do was I literally had to rest and I slept. It took me a good couple weeks for me to recover, and I didn't fully recover until a month later, and then I was able to get back to my own senses and start working to get back onto my feet, and I eventually did. And so when you look back on your trials, even though you think God is silent, but you look back on those, you can actually see those markers of God's grace and his tender mercies. And when you're in the thick of it, you don't see it because you're so focused on what do I need to do now? How am I going to make it just to the next moment? How am I going to survive this? And sometimes God meets us in those moments and we don't recognize it until we look back and we could see he carried us through.
Well, Tim, do you want to give us the bullet points on the Esther acronym? We kind of went through like
Uh,
part of it as we were talking, but we didn't really finish
we
it.
we did. So I'm going to give you the bullet points. You can let me bring up the QR code for people to um there it is. So there's the QR code you can scan to check out Jessica's article on my website. But the bullet and the file you can download has the full acrostics. But the bullet point is, again, embrace your divine placement, w- because it is to recognize that God may transform unwanted circumstances into opportunities for covenantal faithfulness. Our history does not disqualify us from being used by God, does not diminish our purpose, because God meets us where we are, and we look for people already within our reach, those who are within our those who are within our family, community, ministry, or even if you're in a recovery circle. And you want to ask the question, whom has the Lord placed within my reach where I am at? Because we do need people in our lives. We need people to support us. We need people to hold us accountable. We need sandpaper people. If you don't know what a sandpaper person is, they're the people that will rub you the wrong way, but in a very good way, because what does sandpaper do? It helps buff out the rough edges. It helps smooth out the roughness. So sometimes when you meet somebody and they kind of rub you the wrong way, that might be a good person to have around you, because sometimes we may need them to rub out, smooth out those rough edges of our personality, and keep our attitude in check.
And we can
And then
have
there's
compassion too for them because of
right,
that. Yeah.
right. And sometimes we may be the sandpaper people. We may be
And
somebody's sandpaper.
oh, I have to be somebody's sandpaper on a daily basis.
Yeah, me too.
And then S is to seek the Lord through fasting. Esther united her people in fasting before acting. Fasting expresses humility, surrender, and dependence on God, not manipulation, negotiation, or extortion. Because what it really does is it prepares the hearts for obedience when outcomes are completely uncertain. And then we pause before we make any major decisions, because we want to seek out revelation. We want to invite others to fast and pray with us. And I would add to this is that when we fast, we also want to seek out, we always want to, regardless of whether you're fasting or not, you always want to seek out godly counsel in order to make wise and informed decisions, and then follow through on those decisions that we make. And so we want to pause before any major decisions. We want to seek revelation, invite others to fast and pray with us. And this is where intercessory prayer and fasting can be very beneficial for us. And then we take courage. We take courageous action. So that's the T. Preparation needs to lead towards action. Esther entered the king's court despite fear. And courage means faithfulness matters more than our fears, our doubts. If I perish, I perish. It reflects surrender. It does not necessarily reflect despair. And so faith becomes very visible when we take the next right step and trust God with that result. It's where we walk faithfully. We walk in obedience. We obey without delay. And then H is to humble the heart before pride destroys it. So Haman's pride and resentment consumed every blessing. He was not able to see the blessings he received, because pride narrows vision until one offense overshadows any amount of grace, compassion, or empathy. Humility actually protects the heart from vengeance and spiritual destruction. In fact, humility is always referred to as one of the many Christian virtues. I have come to believe that humility is the foundation for all other Christian virtues. And so we examine what controls our emotions. Is it resentment? Is it pride? Or is it grace? Are we being reactive because are we allowing our emotions to manage or rule over us? Or are we responding because we are able to manage our emotions and respond accordingly? It's okay to be angry. It's okay to be upset. It's okay to be frustrated. How you respond out of that makes all the difference. And
And
scripture even speaks to that.
this reminds me of like, like people talk about like toxic masculinity or toxic femininity. And really, I think what it comes down to when you think of those two things is what they're lacking is grace. And it's like if we can learn to respond to each other in grace, then it
Mhm.
builds relationships. And if we don't respond to each other with grace, then it builds pride. So
Right.
going off what you're saying there.
Right. And then We exercise wisdom in timing and speech. So Esther's courage was guided by discernment and timing. She spoke truth with grace. She did not panic. She was not manipulative. Wisdom considers audience, considers purpose, and considers the spirit. And so we speak truth to protect and restore, not to discharge anger. And my thing here is that with wisdom, you speak in a way, you say what you mean and you mean what you say, and you allow wisdom to guide that. And then R is to remember the Lord's reversal and rejoice in deliverance. God turned sorrow to joy and mourning to celebration. Purim became a memorial of deliverance and generosity. Remembering God's faithfulness guards against pride and despair. And gratitude becomes worship. Mercy received becomes mercy extended. And this goes back to what I said earlier is that we tend to be forgetful of God's mercy, of his grace, of what he's brought us through. And then that's where pride slips in. It doesn't announce itself boldly, it slips in with disguise, disguises as empathy, disguises as compassion. But then once it gets into that door and it starts settling in, we begin getting caught up and lifted up in our own pride. It's like, do you really think God helped you out in that moment? I mean, you had to do all the work. So was it really God that did that for you? And you start thinking, yeah, okay. And so, um, I don't know why that showed up on somebody's. um, so that's the acrostic in a nutshell there. So, like I said,
I like it.
you can scan the QR code right over here, and that will take you to the article Jessica wrote and is published over on the website. And you can get the downloadable document with the acrostic for that. And so, this has
Cool.
been a good study.
Yeah, hopefully
So
that
much.
whole chiasm was fun, and I'm going to do it when we get to Isaiah too, so get ready.
Right.
But I just want to put a few notes up really quick, like when you guys are going through, if you guys want, I'll try to get these into like a PDF for you to put on there too, Tim, so people can get the slides, because like here's the whole
Right.
chiastic structure, the way that we went through it tonight. And then there's also like an overview slide that we have. I think I have two. I have this one right here where it shows you kind of like the high level chiasmus, just kind of breaking that down into more of like a high level. And then here's the detailed. And then at the very end, I just kind of ended on it too, because we did this whole Isaiah comparison where you can see the 7-part structure in Isaiah compared to Esther and how similar these are in terms of the theme that's happening. And then because you have a rebellion and a compliance happening in the contrast between Haman and Mordecai and Esther, and like their example versus his. There's so much good stuff in this, and I feel like you could talk about all of these things for hours and hours. But when you guys are reading through these chapters, I just want you to pause and try to think about where you're at in that chiastic structure. Like, where are you
Mhm.
at as you're reading? And think about the theme that's happening there and try to make your interpretations through the lens of the actual structure and what the structure is teaching you about the focal point and the message that's being highlighted at the focal point. Because there's a great reversal happening here. And if you can identify all of these contrasts, it'll help you gather the main message. And ultimately, we're talking about divine orbits and where God places us. But I think one of the things that I really like about this story of Esther is it's to me, it's more than that. It's more than like, okay, where has God placed me? To me, the thing that I love is the idea of the reversal of circumstances, because sometimes it is really hard to see God in the details of our lives. And
Mhm.
sometimes we do feel like he's given us a stone when he only gives bread. Okay. And, sometimes it feels like our lives are left up to chance. Like, what seemed to be happening at the beginning of this story in the first couple chapters compared to the end of the story, where you can see that it's not left up to chance. God is in the details of our lives, but so much is dependent on us and how we choose. It's our choice. And we can either choose the path that leads to death or the path that leads to eternal life. And
Right.
I feel like so many little reversals might happen, from time to time, but ultimately to me life does feel like a Job experience. So we'll have to talk about that when we get to Job, but I just feel like
Right.
it feels hard, and you're really waiting for the reversal at the end,
Well,
right?
I,
Like
I,
the
I
Yeah.
resurrection and the great
yeah.
reversal.
Well, I think since we've started this study through the Old Testament, you and I, Jessica, have picked up on this pattern. Even I think more so when we got into studying Exodus, where we start seeing this descent and ascent, that we descend into mortality, we are ascending into uh, exaltation and immortality. Christ descended into mortality and he ascended into exaltation. Joseph descended and then ascended. And so we see this pattern, and what I like about what you did here is that you took that chiasmus and showed exactly how that pattern actually works, where we descend into our struggles, our crises, our moments of frustration, yet we then are being brought out. We are ascended back into a higher understanding um, in that relationship, and so we ascend into the reality and truthfulness of who God is, and we do that through the covenants. We do that through faith. We do that walking faithfully and being humble and recognizing those markers of grace. And so we start ascending out of our and that's how we overcome. When
Well,
you think about
notice what's happening in this story of Esther though, because and this is what happened in the Joseph of Egypt story too. We're talking about people who are trying to keep covenant. They're trying to maintain a connection
right,
with the Lord. In this case, in the middle of exile. In Joseph's case, it was like in the prison and in all of the places where God allowed him to go, right? Because it was actually through the actions of his brothers that he ended up there. Esther ends up where she is, and it's kind of like through all of the circumstances of life, like the
right,
trials of life, but God uses these people where they are, and what makes them ascend is their commitment to God, even when it looks like they're about to be destroyed. Like even when
right,
Joseph goes into the pit, into the prison, and Esther, even though her and Mordecai are seeing like this plot against them that could ultimately lead to their deaths, they put everything on the altar and they give it to God. And that's what
right,
causes that turning point. And
right.
so that's the pattern that, if you could find one takeaway, figure out in your own life, like, what path am I on? Am I on the Haman path, or am I on the Esther and Mordecai path? Am I on the Joseph of Egypt path, or like the Judah path? Like, remember Judah and Tamar's story? Like, there's all these
Right,
like points where it's like you don't want to go down the wrong road. You want to turn it around. Like Judah turned it around. um, Joseph, he was not on the wrong path. He was on the right path. Esther and Mordecai are on the right path. They're appealing to God for their deliverance in every situation. And that's what we want. We want to be those people that can invite the Lord to fight our battles and give us the guidance and the direction that we need to deal with the circumstances that all of our enemies, everyone who hates us and wants is plotting our demise.
mhm.
We want the Lord's guidance on how to deal with that.
Well, so you mentioned that when we get to the book of Job, which is actually going to be next week.
Yeah.
Is it
I
really?
have I have a paper.
Oh
It's actually not
man.
a paper. It was a lecture that I watched, and it's about temple theology in connection with Job. And what the scholar did was he divided up Job. I think it was into, I can't remember if it was 3 parts or 4 parts, but basically he views each like part of Job's existence, like it, because he essentially lives like a few different lives here, because his life changes so much through all of the catastrophe that's happening, and he starts looking at it as an ascent, but a on a cosmic scale. So he takes the cosmic lens, and what he does is he looks at Job as like a premortal, mortal, and postmortal ascent journey. And so I would like to bring that in if you guys are interested in that. I have a lot of work to do if I'm going to do that, because all I have right now are a bunch of the notes from the slides from the lecture, and I'd have to like go put them all in order into like more
A lot of
organized,
work.
clear cut slides. Yeah, like I'll probably have to start it
Yeah.
tomorrow if we're going to do it. But it was very interesting, and I think that it can answer some of those questions about Job and why it just seems so unreal. But I I want to testify on one thing about Job. He is a real person, no doubt.
Yeah,
Like
we're not going to get
I
into
will
the
bring
argument
that
of whether
in.
he is or is
Yeah, I
not
will. No,
real.
I'll bring that in because I actually have like there's all kinds of scholarly debate. I don't think there's a question when it comes to the restored gospel as to whether or not I can understand why other people might think that, but I think with when you have the restored gospel and you have like the Doctrine and Covenants and the Book of Mormon, you can't look at him as not a real person. He's clearly a real person. Now, did all of those things happen exactly that way? Well, this is what this lens does, is it gives you a lens to kind of see how cosmically and figuratively you might read into Job to be able to understand like the greater plan of salvation. So I'll try to put that together
Yeah.
if I can. If I can't, I'll try to summarize it as best I can if I'm not able to develop the slides. So you guys can look forward to that. It won't be as good as the
I
Esther
will
one
have
though.
lots of work for me because I'm finishing up the draft for spiritual resilience, getting the draft for spiritual realignment, first and second Peter devotionals that I'm working on, and then the study companion for the New Testament, which I hopefully am able to put together and get done and ready to go by December, because we just got notification that the New Testament Come Follow Me manual is out. And so I've been wanting to prepare something that we can bring into these discussions, and you guys can have something tangible to walk along with the Come Follow Me manual.
I'm glad I've deep dived so much, especially with the things that you've brought forward, Jessica, especially going into the New Testament, because I feel like I'm going to understand Christ a lot better knowing what we've studied about the Old Testament and like really getting into like, oh, he was referencing this scripture and this is when
Right.
he was referencing this story and he was, oh, that was a reference back to Job. Oh, that was a reference back to Jonah. Like there were so many things that because I usually struggle studying the New Testament sometimes, because I love everything up in the Gospels and even the Book of Acts. I love it. I will absorb it, and then I get to all of the later books, and I'm like, what? And I think part of that is because I've been reading in the King James version, and it's just kind of hard to
Right.
understand. So I'm going to try the New Living Translation and compare it this year, and kind of see what I can gather that helps me understand some of it more. But yeah,
Tim
I'm
has a
excited.
favorite. Do you want to share your favorite, Tim, for the New Testament?
The NASB 2020, but I have the NASB 1995 edition. But I
Oh
also have
yeah.
the SB and the NLT and the
I
Complete
I've been
Jewish
using the
Study
NLT because
Bible.
that's the one the church recommended for, like, the 8-year-olds to use, and so I'm reading it
Right.
alongside my daughter, and we are loving it, having so much fun reading it.
Well, I just want to kind of bear my testimony, like in closing, guys, because I think one of the things that I've been learning this year is just how much Jesus Christ is in the Old Testament. And even in this story of Esther, I think it's really cool how it doesn't actually mention God in the story, but you see him in the details. And I feel like, I don't know, to me, there's a lesson there. It's that you don't have to necessarily see the face of God and like physically see him to know that he's there and to experience him working in the details of your life. And for me, that's such a true testimony because I feel like, I don't know, I feel like I do have a sure knowledge that Jesus is the Christ. I feel like that's come to me through experiences that I've had that I think are just too sacred for me to share. But I do feel like when we fast and we pray and we do these things that we're seeing exemplified in the scriptures, it is like impossible not to feel God in your life, like
Right.
to not feel his presence. Like if you
Right.
are following that pattern and walking that walk that is being exemplified here in all of these stories that we're reading, and especially that path that the Lord himself walked, which we'll get to in the New Testament, it's just impossible not to feel it. Like you will see the hand of God in your life. You'll feel him on a daily basis. You'll experience the whisperings and the promptings of the Spirit speaking to you and directing your thoughts. And you can exercise the wisdom and the patience of Esther and Job and all of these characters who are, I believe, without a doubt, are just real people who've had real experiences, and their experiences have been turned into these literary masterpieces for us to be able to learn from. And so I'm just really grateful for the gospel. I'm grateful for the restoration because I feel like the scriptures make so much sense. Like there's no questions for me. I feel like we have so many answers, especially with the Book of Mormon and the Doctrine and Covenants as companions and other witnesses of Jesus Christ and the work that he's doing and the fact that he is the Jehovah of the Old Testament. And I think that having that witness for me is the guiding force in my life. It's like I feel like the Spirit has revealed that to me. I've had too many experiences where I feel like Joseph Smith, where he's like, look, I knew that I knew it. God knew that I knew it, and I couldn't deny it. And I feel that way. I feel like God knows that I
Same.
know. He knows, and I know, and I can't deny it. And I believe with all my heart and soul that God, he is in the details and he has a plan for all of us, for all of his children. I really do think that we put too much pressure on ourselves to think that we have to be a certain way or even be a certain religion because I'm not sure that that's necessarily true, at least not yet. I think that eventually we will all come to know the Lord. Like there's nobody who will not at some point, I mean, it's like the scriptures say, every knee will bow, every tongue will confess that Jesus is the Christ. That day will come. And the book of Revelation builds up to that day. And
Right.
this story in Esther, I think, is giving you kind of like that same template. There is a turning point there. There's a great reversal that'll happen eventually. And just the way that the story of Esther concludes with Mordecai in this exalted station. I mean, those last few verses in chapter 10, it says, and the king Ahasuerus laid a tribute upon the land and upon the isles of the sea, and all the acts of his power and of his might, and the declaration of the greatness of Mordecai, whereunto the king advanced him. Are they not written in the book of the chronicles of the kings of Media and Persia? For Mordecai the Jew was next unto King Ahasuerus, and great among the Jews, and accepted of the multitude of his brethren, seeking the wealth of his people and speaking peace to all his seed. And I think that that example that you see with Mordecai and Esther is the work that if we've made a covenant with the Lord, this is what he expects, is that we are going to seek the wealth of his people and speaking peace to all his seed. And for us, I think that's why we're doing this work of trying to gather. We're gathering Israel so that we can gather all of God's children back to him. The end.
So, with that, we have been going for almost 4 hours. I think this is the longest we've had on this small book, but it is good. I appreciate you being here, Rachel. I know it's late where you're at,
Yeah, and I'm
and
so sorry for my lateness and everything to the conversation.
I'm
that
so
that
glad
is
you
It's been
fine.
busy.
joined. Thank you.
I start school tomorrow teaching. Yay!
Oh,
Not excited.
that's
But
good.
so
We are
gotta
here
get going
every
here, but
Sunday evening, 7:30 p.m. Pacific time, 8:30 p.m. Mountain Standard Time. We are going through and discussing the Old Testament. Next week is going to be about the book of Job. We're probably got a lot of information in a short amount of time to discuss it. And so appreciate you guys hanging out. Appreciate you guys checking out my channel, checking out Jessica's channel. And as always, be blessed, be inspired, be encouraged, because at the end of the day, we're all pressing forward with steadfast faith through Jesus Christ, because it is He that lives through us, not that we live according to our own will and purpose. So until next time, be blessed, be encouraged, be inspired. Have a great night, folks, and we'll
Good
see you
night.
next Sunday.